Chapter 214. As the saying goes, what you think of in the day, you dream of it at night. Dark spent an entire day on the records of the refining array. Naturally, he dreamt of something related to it. In the dream, he successfully created 12 gold saint garments. Every week, he would randomly create a gold saint garment for 2 consecutive weeks. What? There were 14 days in 2 weeks, but there were only 12 saint garments. Wasn't it common knowledge that there were 14 gold saint garments out of 12? Wouldn't it be great if he could create a great sin equipment after collecting all the gold saint garments? Then what 12 gold saint garments, what Valkyrie? No, he had to give Ibuchan a small dress first. Other people's familiars have small dresses, so do our phantasmal beasts. Bang! Remember the website, Vipkanshu. Ibuchan, who was forced to put on a small dress, kicked him in the face. Dark suddenly woke up from his stupor amidst the loud explosion. The moment he turned his head, an unbelievable scene appeared in front of him. There was a huge hole in the side of the dragon's nest mirror room. GG. A few minutes ago, Vlad had been gathering his emotions outside the secret room for 3 whole minutes before he slapped the wall with his palm. Although his memories were very fragmented, and he didn't even know where he was, he could still see through a hidden door that could be triggered by pouring magic power into it. Just like how he could see through White and the other's magic power and current level in a very short period of time after he woke up. Among the 4 human children, the sturdiest one was only at the level of a magic apprentice, and his magic power talent was relatively ordinary. However, his physique was not bad, and he could barely be considered a magic swordsman. Unfortunately, he was wearing a uniform similar to a magic robe, and he was probably on the wrong path. The other one was thin and tall with a pockmarked face. His magic power talent was slightly better than the first one, but it was limited. Moreover, his physique was weak, and there was no room for him to change his profession. In the demon race, he was at the bottom of the pile. On the other hand, the only girl had the temperament of a sage, and her magic power talent was not bad. Unfortunately, she was born a human and her magic power was limited. At best, she could become an elite human mage in the future. What surprised Vlad the most was that the black-haired youth actually had a magical talent that was not inferior to a high-level demon. This made him immediately want to take him as a blood slave. Of course, that was after he had enjoyed himself to his heart's content. As the palm covered in magic power slammed against the wall, the entrance to the secret passage suddenly opened. Vlad sneered and lowered his head as he prepared to enter. However, as soon as he lowered his head, the sound of thunder suddenly exploded. An electric eel with flashes of lightning burrowed out of it and swallowed Vlad's head in one gulp. Vlad raised his head abruptly and raised his hands almost instantly. Before the electric eel could swallow him whole, he grabbed its jaws. White! Betty's screams rose into the air. Here! White abruptly responded, and a snow-white giant python abruptly drilled out of the card. The narrow secret room could not accommodate such a huge radiant python at all. Other than White, everyone else was pressed against the walls. White held the magic card in her hand and watched as the radiant python's upper body appeared in the light. Then she charged out of the secret room and knocked Vlad, who was blocking the entrance, flying out. Together with the electric eel, which was only slightly smaller than the radiant python, it crashed into the opposite wall. Boom! A loud sound rang out. White suddenly roared. Holy light! Holy white light burst out of the radiant python's mouth, burning the vampire's skin like a raging flame. Light and darkness restrained each other, and Vlad felt the first pain after his resurrection. But this was only the beginning. Seeing that Vlad's body was weakening, Betty immediately activated a magic card she had prepared beforehand, Thunder Liquid Bomb. Magic cards could be divided into 2 types. One was activated by the Magus, and the other was attached to the magic fairy and released in the form of a sure kill skill. Betty's magic card belonged to the latter. The grade 7 water/lightning dual element white card, the giant Canaan eel, finally had the means to unleash its lightning energy with the help of Thunder Liquid Bomb. Its upper and lower jaws were still firmly held by Vlad, but thunder liquid flowed out of its throat and poured over Vlad's head. Then, more thunder liquid condensed into a ball in its mouth, and the crackling sound of thunder and lightning could be heard incessantly. After the giant Canaan eel gathered its energy in an extremely short amount of time, the ball of thunder liquid that seemed like it could explode at any time smashed into Vlad's head. Boom! The explosion at such a close distance blew the giant Canaan eel's head off. The magic fairy card in Betty's hand dimmed in an instant. White's radiant python was not spared either. But if it could kill Vlad at such a price, then it would be a stroke of luck. The four of them stared with wide eyes at the vampire surrounded by the thunder liquid. They wanted nothing more than to stare at it and turn it into minced meat. Cough! The vampire's body jerked violently. The thunder liquid attached to his head was shaken off and fell to the ground. White and the others immediately tensed up. Betty's reaction was the fastest, and she almost immediately rushed out of the secret room. Vlad had completely taken the damage of the thunder liquid bomb, but he was still alive. The secret room that had been discovered was no longer a place to hide. On the contrary, the small size of the secret room would hinder their escape. Run! She didn't say anything else, and turned around to escape as soon as she left the secret room. Although Keat and Luoboat's brains didn't work as fast as hers, they didn't need to think to escape. Only White was stunned for a moment, and then hurriedly followed. But just as he reached the entrance of the secret room, he suddenly had an extremely ominous premonition. It wasn't the first time he had that feeling. And every time it appeared, it was when a crisis was about to strike. His many experiences allowed him to react as quickly as possible. In that instant, he abruptly stopped, moved sideways and stuck close to the wall. After that, less than half a second later, the vampire, whose entire body was flowing with lightning liquid, suddenly opened its mouth. Using its 4 fangs as fulcrum, blood-like magic power converged in the middle. In an instant, it completed the process from nothingness. A huge magic array instantly popped out. Then, a blood-colored beam of light suddenly burst out through the magic array's amplification. White, who was stuck to the wall, saw the blood-red beam of light, which was thicker than the waist of the radiant python, rush past his eyelids. Then, it shot straight toward the mirror in front of him. White broke out in a cold sweat. This was the first time he had narrowly escaped death, and his heart almost jumped out of his chest. The mirror that was hit by the beam of light melted without any pause. The light that escaped through the reflection of the mirror quickly dyed the entire secret room red. White's face was blood red, and his body couldn't help but tremble. It took him a long time to realize that it wasn't just the mirrors that were melted, but also the wall behind the mirrors, or rather, some kind of spatial structure. A huge hole appeared in the secret room, and it connected to another mirror room. The sound of the explosion quickly subsided. Panting sounds could be heard from all around. Cold wind flew back and forth in the hole, and the airflow on both sides interacted. Betty and the other 2 who were lucky enough to escape the secret room couldn't help but stop. Luoboat screamed in horror and ran back with all his might. White! His voice was full of fear, and he didn't even have time to deal with the vampire who was right in front of him. The thunder liquid on Vlad's face had all dripped down, revealing his true appearance at this moment. His originally elegant long hair had been completely destroyed, and most of his face had been melted by the thunder liquid bomb, revealing his pale bones. His lipless mouth was still half open. Steaming blood mist spread around his mouth. He was in a sorry state. He was in a sorry state. He was in a sorry state. Flames of anger burned in Vlad's eyes, and the melted skin was healing at a visible speed. However, hair was harder to regrow than skin. A few strands of long hair hung from the top of his head, looking lonely and desolate. The corners of his clothes that had been blasted to pieces by the thunder liquid bomb turned into sticky threads of blood, and a complete set of clothes was reconstructed. Vlad ignored Luoboat, who was nearby, and suddenly turned his gaze to the fleeing Betty. He couldn't figure out how this human girl, whose magic power was only passable, could summon that Canaan electric eel. There was no information related to it in his fragmented memories. Could it be that this human girl actually had a unique and rare talent in summoning magic? Vlad's expression became more and more sinister. Betty had become the second person he wanted to embrace. Only by turning her into a blood thrall could he wash away his previous humiliation. Luo Boat rushed into the secret room. The secret room was a mess, and he almost thought that White had evaporated. Over here. It wasn't until White reminded him in a weak voice that Luo Boat abruptly turned around and saw White leaning against the wall by the entrance. Great, you're still alive. Luo Boat hugged White, unable to suppress the ecstasy on his face. White's body went weak, and he could only let him hug him. Where's the vampire? The vampire. Luo Boat finally remembered and his face paled. Still alive. It was a simple sentence. After that sentence, White struggled to walk out of the secret room. It was also at this time that he finally noticed that there was a huge hole in one of the walls of the secret room. However, because the other side of the hole was also a mirror room filled with mirrors, it created a visual error for a moment. Luo Boat had noticed it the moment he entered. However, he didn't have the mind to think about it at the time. Now that he looked at it again, he couldn't help but think. So there's an even bigger secret room in the secret room? This thought came to an abrupt end when he heard the sound of wings flapping from the other side of the hole. Little Devil slowly flew to the entrance of the hole, and pretended not to react as he looked at White and Luo Boat in the narrow secret room, and cursed in his heart. Such an iconic familiar was unique in the whole of Shangmalian. White and Luo Boat almost immediately realized who the person in front of them was. We can escape from the hole. If Dake is here. Different thoughts crossed their minds. Dark Diamond followed closely behind the little demonic beast and appeared in their field of vision. Hey! Who would have thought that the hero's secret room and the Valkyrie's secret room were only separated by a wall? Judging from the scale, Hero Brett might have just dug out a little from the Valkyrie's scraps. Maybe he was just following the trend so that when he chatted with someone he could say, "Hey, you're hiding it too?" "I'm hiding it too." They carefully peeked in that direction. "Don't you guys look great?" White and Luo Boat looked conflicted. But before they could say anything, Vlad, who had been running towards Betty, suddenly appeared at the entrance of the secret room. His body was covered in scars, and the color difference between the old and new skin made his face look like it was sewn together from rags. Vlad's eyes were sharp, and the new human child in front of him gave him an indescribable feeling. It was an uncontrollable feeling that could only be detected by high-ranking demons. It was so strong that when he smelled Dake's scent, he suppressed the humiliation in his heart and put punishing Betty second. But he couldn't tell what that feeling was. In short, it was very faint and very strange. It made him uneasy. White and Luo Boat were frightened by Vlad's sudden appearance and couldn't help but move towards Dake. Vlad didn't react to their actions. Dake, however, hesitated. A vampire. Because it didn't look like cosplay, Dake couldn't help but tense up. Perhaps they thought that Vlad would harm White and Luo Boat. Betty, who didn't know that she had just escaped, launched a sneak attack in order to give them a chance to escape. Skunk bullet. A brown bullet rolled to Vlad's feet and suddenly exploded. The smoke from the bullet instantly spread out, and a fatal stench burst out. This was a skill released by a mere 2-star magic fairy, but it had an unexpected effect. Vlad screamed in the smoke. White mustered the last of her strength at the critical moment and dragged her weak legs into the huge cave. Luo Boat was a bit slower, but he caught up first. He grabbed Vlad's arm and dashed forward. The narrow secret room was crossed in an instant. Dake, who was on the opposite side, immediately moved to the side, allowing the two to escape through the huge cave. "A vampire?" Dake asked again. "A vampire," Luo Boat hurriedly replied. The last trace of sleepiness in Dake's eyes suddenly disappeared. At this time, there was no point in thinking about why a vampire would appear in the secret passage. Since even the Minotaurus could appear out of thin air, One more vampire wouldn't be a big deal. Prepare for battle. 2 in 1, 4,000 words. Oh, I made it. I gave myself a monthly ticket before 6 o'clock to encourage myself. There's a gold and silver treasure chest between 18 and 20 o'clock tonight. There's a high chance of drawing cat biscuits from the silver one. Chapter 2:15. Seeing that White and Luo boat had already escaped behind him, Dake immediately asked, "What is it?" "Level, strength, ability." Took White half a second to react. She hurriedly said, "3rd tier, very strong, can shoot magic light cannons, high-speed regeneration." Dake's eyelids twitched. 3rd tier means at least 7-star. It has long-range skills, which means it's not a blank slate. And high-speed regeneration. Is it an orthodox high-level demon? Vampires might not be as powerful as demonic dragons, but they were often more difficult to deal with than demonic dragons. They were often more agile and unpredictable. Simply put, the rolling tactic was very difficult to use. It's decided then, Kettle. In short, the all-powerful Kettle. Although Huahu was not big in size, it still looked imposing as it blocked the hole. When there was nothing to do, its back was always reassuring. Dake quickly said, "There's only one way out from here. If you go straight out, you'll reach the outside of the cave. But this dragon's cave is in a basin. If you want to go up, you'll have to climb." Dragon's cave. Luo Boat's voice suddenly changed. Dake was already fully focused. The timing of the vampires being disrupted by the skunk bomb was very precious, and it was obvious that there was someone else outside the secret room. Although he didn't know who it was, it seemed more reliable than Luo Boat. In short, he had to buy as much time as possible. After the cooldown ended, Dake quickly summoned a second magic guide sprite, Fantasy Beast, Polymorph. He had a feeling that the Polymorph's transformation skill would be the core of this battle. But so far, the Polymorph had never transformed into a 3rd-tier magic guide sprite, so it wasn't very reliable to bet all his chips on the Polymorph. Therefore, after summoning the Polymorph, he took Claire's Christmas present, Paradise. Dake's intention was very clear. White was shocked to realize that Dake wasn't thinking about how to escape after learning the basic information about vampires. Instead, he was preparing for battle. Was it because a 7-star vampire wasn't enough to make him retreat? However, based on Dake's performance in the class competition, even though he was good, he wasn't that good. Unless he had made a huge improvement in the short period of time after the class competition. Thinking of this, White felt a little relieved, but at the same time he felt a ton of pressure. He clenched his fist and took out his final trump card, Taboo Love. He knew that Taboo Love wouldn't be effective against creatures with high intelligence other than magic elves, especially high-level demons with powerful magic power. But if he could be of any use to the vampires at a critical moment, he would feel a little more at ease. At this very moment, Betty and C. Keat, who were outside the secret chamber, did not know that the 2 mirror chambers had been connected. They were surprised by the vampire's sudden action, but they didn't dare to provoke him too much. Vlad's scream from the skunk bomb made them tremble in fear. C. Keat had already slipped to the corner, half of her head trembling uneasily. Betty was also slowly retreating, ready to escape at any time. A vampire's sense of smell was as sharp as a werewolf's. The skunk bomb had almost destroyed Vlad's olfactory system. He screamed as he dispersed the smoke and took in big breaths of fresh air, looking more and more miserable. He couldn't help but turn his attention to Betty again. Roar! Vlad bared his teeth and roared. He swung his claw at Betty, and a bloody claw flew out and grabbed at her. Betty's heart tightened and she turned to run. Suddenly there was an explosion in the air. The invisible barrier was torn apart by the bloody claw, but it was stopped. Betty took the opportunity to slip into the corner and out of Vlad's sight. She and C. Keat each took a side, not daring to show their heads again. Both of them were nervous, afraid that Vlad would chase after them. However, after the vampire swung his claw, he no longer paid any attention to them. In the blink of an eye, the vampire had already rushed into the secret room. Betty instinctively took a step forward, but then hesitated. What could she do if she rushed back? He couldn't do anything. After the moon god incident, the members of the church had matured a lot. Their personality flaws might not have changed, but they thought about things on a different level. Betty and C. Keith's eyes met, and they both knew what the other meant. There was no hope. From their point of view, White and Luo Boat were already beyond saving. If they didn't escape now, they would also die in the vampire's mouth. They had to escape. The two reached a consensus. The howling vampire that had rushed into the secret room was blasted out at an even faster speed. Boom! Betty and C. Keith couldn't understand. Vlad, who had almost turned into a pancake, slid down from the wall. He supported his body with his feet and held his forehead with his hand. He felt that his brain was swollen, and he couldn't understand what had just happened. A tortoise-like mollusk had punched him in the face. How could the mighty Lord Vlad be sent flying with a single soft punch? Well, it seemed that at the moment of contact with the fist, something had flowed out of his body, causing him to be weak for a moment. The mollusk seized that moment of weakness and gave him a head-on blow. Vlad's mind gradually cleared, and he struggled to stand up. His vitality, which had already been weakened by the thunder liquid bomb, was further weakened. But Huhus' blow to the head finally woke him up completely. He began to calm down, and was no longer full of contempt like before. However, at this moment the entire world underwent a drastic change. Vlad's expression changed greatly. His blood-red cloak unfurled angrily, and a pair of pitch-black bat wings stretched out, carrying him high into the sky. As soon as his feet left the ground, magic power spread to his feet. He had never seen that kind of strange magic wave in his life, even though he didn't have much memory of it. But that feeling of unfamiliarity and fear couldn't fool him. Vlad didn't want to admit that a human child could make him feel fear. Mana veins instantly covered the surroundings, densely packed like a grid. Buildings, which seemed to have been moved out of a fairy tale world, rose from the ground one after another. The whole world had been forcibly squeezed into the paradise, filling it to the brim. A merry-go-round with colorful lights appeared in the dragon's nest, scaring White and Luo Boat to jump away. A small section of the haunted house entered the hero's secret room, and a ghost wearing a sheet floated in it. A huge Ferris wheel rose outside the secret room, directly reaching the ceiling. The secret passage, which had become gloomy and silent due to the arrival of the vampire, was suddenly filled with a cheerful melody. The golden-haired young master walked out of the secret chamber and looked up at the vampire who was on top of the Ferris wheel. Their gazes met in the air, but there were no sparks. Betty and C. Keith, who were hiding in the corner, were startled by the hedgehog cat trash can that suddenly appeared behind them. They almost screamed. C. Keith looked at the golden-haired young man who walked out of the secret room with a pale face. It wasn't the first time she felt frightened. Why was the one who walked into the secret room White Gouda, but the one who walked out was Dake Dimming? Could the secret room, which was full of mirrors, turn into a living person? It's a field card. Betty looked at the golden-haired young man, who was only a first-year student, and was shocked. The creation of a field card was extremely complicated and tedious. Even a fourth-year student might not be able to create one successfully. Most of the magisters could only master some simple methods of creating field cards after graduation. Even a top student like her had only refined one water field card, and it hadn't been of much use. Students who had high-level field cards were almost all the top students in their respective years. Even though she didn't know the effects of paradise, she could tell from the details of the projection that it was an extremely high-level card. However, she didn't have any ill feelings towards Dake. The stronger the student who appeared at this time, the more reassuring it was. She suppressed the thought of running away and stared at the golden-haired young man who was still calm and graceful in the face of a high-level vampire. Her fingers trembled slightly. The sound of her heartbeat suddenly became louder. Vlad's attack came without warning. The field card hadn't fully opened yet, and he attacked in an instant. Bright red liquid flowed out from his cloak and climbed up his arm. He clenched his fist slightly, and the bright red liquid turned into a blood-red rapier. He flapped his bat-like wings and his body swooped down. In the blink of an eye, Vlad's body was already within 3 meters of Dake. His arm and rapier moved forward, and the sharp wind from the rapier almost pierced Dake's forehead. Dake's bangs flew upwards, and his eyes were stimulated by the strong wind, and he couldn't help but squint. "Careful!" The frightened voices of the young boys and girls came from all directions. Vlad's expression suddenly changed, and he froze in midair, his rapier still in a downward posture. A pale hand grabbed the blade of the rapier, and with a little force it bent back. Vlad's expression was one of struggle, and he finally couldn't help but abandon the rapier and retreat. No matter how big his heart was, he couldn't remain indifferent after seeing his other self walk out from behind the human youth. Strange. He felt extremely uncomfortable from the moment the human youth appeared. Now he was so frightened that his scalp was numb. They hadn't even clashed yet, but his aura had already hit rock bottom. After he retreated, his back was pressed against the ceiling, and the bloody light in his eyes flickered uncertainly. Saliva flowed down his throat, causing his Adam's apple to undulate. He swallowed his saliva and bared his fangs. He finally squeezed out a hoarse voice from between his teeth. "Who are you?" A 3,000-word chapter. Where's the treasure chest? Maybe he was stood up. Chapter 216. Who am I? I'm just a student with a bad temper after waking up. Dake did not answer Vlad's question directly. The success of the multiform monster's transformation was beyond his expectations. He injected his magic power into Fantasy Beast, ever-changing monster, and soon received feedback on the information. Card name: Fantasy Beast, multiform monster. Type: Fairy card. Level: ********. Race: Fiend. Website: https://vipkanchu. VIP attribute: Dark. Magic power: 600. Attack: +200 out defense. +200 a ultimate skill: None. Obviously, this was not a normal transformation. The multiform monster's transformation had always had 2 modes. One was a normal shape change. The other was the transformation skill. The former could freely transform into other objects with information stored in its memory. However, it would only change its appearance, and the transformation would often be incomplete. The latter could copy part of the opponent's data to increase its attack, defense, and skills. However, it could only be used on the magic fairy and could not be higher than its own level. In the beginning, Dake only wanted to transform it into Vlad's appearance, and then use some small tricks to increase its ability. He wanted to interfere with Vlad's mind and suppress him on a tactical level. Therefore, he had to appear confident and calm in order to fool Vlad. However, after the transformation, the multiform monster's magic circulation had a problem. Originally, the magic fairy in his hand had its information recorded in Paradise. Once it opened up, it could form an energy cycle with Paradise and the other magic fairies in Paradise. The more magic fairies there were, the greater the energy cycle and the more benefits it would have. The various abilities of the magic fairy would naturally be affected by the energy cycle. This was also one of the mechanisms of the field card. In other words, it was affected by the Paradise's field. The multiform monster's transformation in Paradise was affected by this. To be more precise, it was affected by the haunted house in Paradise. After Dake obtained Paradise, he did not do much research, so his understanding of Paradise was still superficial. This type of magic card was based on the feedback of magic power. The information given to the Magister was actually very basic. If he wanted to have a deeper understanding and dig out the potential of the magic card itself, he would have to repeatedly experiment and develop it. Just like this time, Dake realized that in the haunted house in paradise, certain abilities such as disguise, imitation, and transformation would be enhanced to different degrees. According to this train of thought, perhaps it would be even more effective on undying species, spectre-type magic spirits, and other magic spirits. In any case, after gaining the buff from the haunted house, the shape-shifting monster's transformation skill had a breakthrough. The first was the increase in universality. The target of transformation was no longer limited to magic elves. With the support of the field, the polymorph monster was able to copy part of the data of objects other than the enchanted sprite, although this part of the data was likely to be discounted. The second was the improvement of his basic abilities. Transformation was no longer limited to those on the same level and below. Cloning across the ladder became feasible. However, it could not exceed the amount of data of those at the same level. However, it changed from can only copy data up to the highest level of the same rank to can only copy data up to the highest level of the same rank, and it was incomplete. Take the current situation for example. The polymorph monster was now in the state of Bliss 3, and its star level had increased to 4 stars. It belonged to the second-tier magic spirits. Originally, it could only copy part of the data of the highest 6-star magic spirits. However, in the haunted house, it could copy the state data of the vampire, which should be a 7-star vampire, when it was a 6-star. This part of the data would be more blurry, fluctuating within a certain range of values, and was very unstable. Just like the DNA of the polymorph monster, it was constantly changing. In addition, it did not successfully copy the killer skill. This was very likely because the ability of the haunted house was not perfect. Regarding this point, it could be the development direction of the next version of Paradise. Dake's thoughts turned. The polymorph monster now had the attack and defense panel of the vampire when it was a 6-star vampire. Due to the buff of Paradise, each of its magic attack and defense had increased by 200 points. However, it did not have a killer skill. The transformation completed based on the foundation of Bliss 3 could only last for 15 minutes. This 15 minutes was the line between life and death. However, in a magic duel, 15 minutes was a full 30 rounds. It was more than enough. Confidence came from an accurate understanding of his own strength. Dake raised his head to look at Vlad. There was already a stack of cards in his hand. He spread out the stack of cards like a peacock spreading its tail. Then he pulled out a card. He used the usual summoning spell. It was as smooth as silk. Under the effect of Paradise summoning time -1s. In just 2 seconds, a magic spirit appeared beside Dake. The polymorph monster's magic attack and defense increased by 100. After that, it was only 5 seconds. The 4th magic guide spirit was successfully summoned. Then the 5th, the 6th. It was not until the little monsters were locked in the spell cages that they were summoned. A total of 7 magic spirits, including the polymorph monster, gathered beside Dake. All 7 magic guide fairies received an increase in magic attack and defense by 700 each. Dake waved his hand slightly, and they retreated into the secret room behind him, the haunted house. The ghost that was born with the haunted house poked its head out and looked around curiously. Vlad was very puzzled by Dake's summoning of so many low-level monsters in one go. However, he was indeed frightened by the polymorph monster, so he did not act rashly. Little did he know that in this short period of time, the polymorph monster's magic had increased to 1100 points, and its attack and defense panel had very likely surpassed his. As the saying went, if one step was slow, every step would be slow. He had completely lost all opportunities. The next one to blow the horn to attack would definitely not be him. Hurry, hurry! From the mouth of the polymorph monster, vampire transformation, came the polymorph monster's cry. Dake's expression froze and he shouted, "Go!" The polymorph monster, who was already eager to give it a try, suddenly exerted strength in its legs and suddenly exploded. Its entire body turned into a red arrow and shot toward the vampire on the ceiling. The battle was about to start. Vlad was forced to fight. The rapier in his right hand shook and returned to its straight position. He spread his wings and swooped down like an eagle. Using the acceleration of gravity, he began a direct confrontation with the polymorph monster. The moment they exchanged blows, Vlad's rapier was firmly grasped by the polymorph monster's left hand. The polymorph monster grabbed the rapier and pulled it back, instantly pulling Vlad's body close. Then its right arm clenched into a fist and fiercely smashed Vlad's nose, almost breaking it. Vlad's nose bled as he screamed. He simply gave up on the rapier. The blood cloak on his back turned into a fist, reaching out from his shoulder and fiercely smashing at the polymorph monster. However, the polymorph monster clearly had the upper hand in terms of speed. While it dodged to the side, it even threw a punch at Vlad's face. Boom! Vlad was smashed into the Ferris wheel, and the polymorph monster suddenly caught up. The two of them began to fight each other on the Ferris wheel with their fists. "This is not what I want," Vlad roared in pain. After a little more than a minute of fighting, he could no longer hold on. This moment, following the summoning of the Diru beast, the polymorph monster's magic attack and defense both increased by 100. The difference in power between the two sides was once again widened. Vlad suffered a pain that a noble vampire shouldn't have to endure. He was forced back in his battle with himself, and both the physical and mental pressure had reached a peak. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore, and a flash of magic burst out from his palm. Two magic arrays rotating in opposite directions suddenly appeared. He seized the opportunity and fiercely pushed his palm towards the polymorph monster's chest. But the moment before he made his move, that strange feeling of weakness appeared once again. His attack paused, and the magic beam he shot out again only had half of its power left. That bit of power only left a scorch mark on the polymorph monster's chest. Busy! The polymorph monster used Vlad's body to make an innocent tilted head kill. Fuck! Vlad's mental state suffered another heavy blow. In the next moment, a beam of magic light instantly arrived and brushed past the base of his thigh, leaving behind a horrifying wound that was dripping with blood. Vlad abruptly lowered his head as he screamed, only to see a harmless magic elf about to close its mouth. It was Ivan who had used imitation. With the buff of paradise, Ivan was no longer a little cutie who could kill people with a single skill. He stuck out his tongue, and only felt that the magic beam that was shot out of his mouth was unexpectedly spicy. Vlad's face was ashen, and he wondered if he had run into some top-secret summoner base. Where did these unheard-of summoned beasts come from? But the polymorph monster was at the peak of its excitement, and wouldn't give him a chance to stop and take a breather. Vlad was only distracted for a moment, and he was sent flying with a punch. The iron frame of the Ferris wheel was twisted from the impact. His magic was constantly being used up on high-speed regeneration. Pain and humiliation pressed on his nerves. Vlad's face became more and more sinister, and the red light that erupted from his eyes was terrifying. Suddenly, the blood cloak on his back suddenly opened, and countless bats swarmed out from under it. The polymorph monster didn't have time to react before it was surrounded and bitten by the bats. Vlad then revealed a sinister smile. After these 2 minutes of fighting, he was sure that he had found the polymorph monster's weakness. At best, it's a human-summoned beast, and even its flaws are exactly the same. Vlad, who had climbed up from the Ferris wheel, took a deep breath. The bats that were transformed from his true form had fangs comparable to vampires, and even the toughest skin couldn't stop the bats from biting. The hormones injected through the fangs would paralyze the prey's nerves. Not only could they absorb blood, they could also absorb magic. The polymorph monster only had 1,200 magic points, and it had already used up more than half in the fight just now. Now that it was surrounded and absorbed by hundreds of bats, it wouldn't be long before it was sucked dry. "Little fiend monster," they called out softly. The little fiend monster, who had been waiting for a long time, suddenly became spirited. Then, a dark golden beam of light shone into its forehead. The little fiend monster, who had turned from 1 star to 2 stars, immediately opened its eyes wide. Demon hypnosis. A light wave with a hypnotic effect was instantly emitted. Vlad suddenly lowered his head. At first, he thought that it was some terrifying and strange magic, but after being hypnotized, he only felt a trace of sleepiness and couldn't help but yawn. He couldn't help but laugh at the slight effect. Then his eyes suddenly widened, and he saw those bat clones falling down like dumplings. Heartsuit, heartsuit. Then a bewitching sound was heard. The sound wave that turned into a large area of water swept over, and the hundreds of brittle bats were all shattered. There were traces of blood left on the ground. "Hurry, hurry!" The polymorph monster that had escaped let out an angry cry. But a snow-white and petite figure suddenly swept past it. Cat, cat, fist. The claws that had copied the golden sword lion's data instantly tore Vlad's chest apart. The remnant light energy burned the wound that was so deep that the bone could be seen. The dilute beast's attack value had been stacked to 3,200. Perhaps it was slightly weaker than Vlad at his peak, but it wasn't difficult to deal with the injured and exhausted Vlad. It flashed around on the Ferris wheel, showing its ruthless killer side. Vlad didn't even have time to think before he was forced to flee by the light element's natural enemy. After a few minutes of fleeing, he suddenly discovered that the hateful white cat's power had increased dramatically. What the hell is going on? He couldn't understand. Vlad crazily roared in his heart. For the first time, he felt fear toward a human magician. The milk jug that had just been summoned passed its milk to the polymorph monster that was already showing signs of exhaustion. The polymorph monster immediately looked as if it had received a treasure. It raised its head and drank. Immediately, a strong vitality flowed into its limbs and bones, and the magic that had been depleted by more than half was almost fully recovered. It excitedly cried out a few times to express its gratitude, then spread its wings and once again shot toward the panicked Vlad. Poor Vlad. It was already difficult to deal with one magic guide fairy, and now it was even more difficult to deal with two. If it was a magic guide fairy, it would have most likely died by now due to exhaustion of magic. As a high-level vampire, its terrifying vitality still played a role. Even if he was beaten into a sorry state, he was still alive. But being alive now didn't mean that he would be alive in the future. Vlad felt the threat of death was already in front of his eyes. The scythe of the Grim Reaper was almost at his neck. From the arrogance when he first appeared to the fear now, only a short period of time had passed, but Vlad's view of the world had already been turned upside down. He desperately held on, his spirit stretched to the limit, his brain abnormally active. "I don't want to die. But how can I not die?" Vlad suddenly burst out with a terrifying magic wave, and a line of blood shot out from his fingers like a blade that tore through the void. The Dilu beast and the polymorph monster were instantly forced back. Vlad's eyes focused and his feet kicked back. Boom! A loud explosion. The vampire that had spread its wings and was surrounded by the line of blood shot toward the blonde youth on the ground like a missile. 2-in-1 4,200 words. Giving away a few hundred words every day for free, what a loss. Monthly votes, monthly votes, monthly votes. 40+. Chapter 217. Archmages were still a magic profession. Archmages like the Valkyrie were still a minority. Vlad wasn't wrong to view them as summoners. It was just a summoner, just a part of a magus. If one really treated archmages as summoners, then the end result would often be fatal. Many demons had made this mistake in the early days of the rise of the archmages, and had paid a huge price for it. Vlad's diving speed was undeniably fast. Decapitation was also very effective against a summoner. Under normal circumstances, A summoner's weak physique wouldn't be able to dodge this sudden attack at all. Vlad pointed a finger at Dake before he even touched him. Remember the URL. Vipkanshu. VIP. The line of blood that shot out from his fingertip wrapped around his body. At this moment, with his fingertip as the point, it instantly shot towards the golden-haired youth on the ground. If this attack hit, the blade-like threads of blood would shred the youth to pieces in the blink of an eye. But Dake wasn't someone who would get carried away at a time like this. Since he was standing right under a vampire's nose, he was naturally prepared to deal with a surprise attack at any moment. In the nick of time, Dake's figure suddenly disappeared from Vlad's sight. The fatal threads of blood pierced through the air and shot into the ground. Vlad's expression changed drastically. He turned his head in the direction of the smell and saw the blonde youth appear in the open space 3 meters away. Dake, who had used the blink charm to dodge this fatal attack, looked coldly at Vlad, who had been brought to a sudden stop in front of the secret room. Snap! He snapped his fingers. The Hawkman hiding in the secret room, haunted house, immediately used his one and only killing move, Feather Dance. Just a flap of his wings and a large amount of feathers flew out, surrounding Vlad in a gust of wind. Moo! The milk can curled into a ball as he charged, a metallic luster appearing on the surface of his body. He relied solely on the defense of the rounding charm to roll forward and crash into Vlad. The moment Vlad landed on the ground, he had wanted to continue with his decapitation strategy, but his vision was interrupted by Feather Dance. Then he was hit by the milk can, and his entire plan was ruined. He was forced to turn toward the milk jug. He manipulated the blood threads to entangle it and threw another punch. Bang! This punch was so powerful that it sent the milk jug flying back into the secret chamber. However, Vlad felt a sharp pain in his finger after the punch. It was as if he had punched a steel plate and the bones in his finger were about to break. He endured the pain and suddenly turned around, only to discover that the 2 magic guiding fairies he had forced away had already landed on the ground. The Diru beast's eyes were filled with anger. It was extremely angry that Vlad had bypassed it to attack its master. As soon as it landed on the ground, it charged forward and aimed a furious cat fist at Vlad's chin. If Blood Cloak hadn't blocked it in time, Vlad's jaw would have been crushed. The multiform monster didn't think so much. It followed closely behind the Diru beast and joined forces with the Diru beast to suppress the vampire. Therefore, the battle shifted from the sky to the ground. However, the battle situation did not change at all. Vlad retreated step by step. It was only a matter of time before he was defeated. At this time, Betty and Keat, who had witnessed the whole process of Dake being ambushed, let out a sigh of relief. White and Luo Boat, who were peeking from the other side of the secret chamber, also noticed that Vlad had been completely suppressed. The 2 of them felt relieved and shocked at the same time. Not to mention the magic guiding fairy that could transform, Dake's Diru beast had also appeared in the class competition. Its 3 attributes that had surpassed its level by relying on the divine holy ring had already shocked everyone at that time. However, now that it was facing a 3rd-tier vampire, it was actually on par with him. Is it the effect of that field card? He had mixed feelings. Not long after Fairy Ibu was summoned, the effect of Paradise was displayed to the extreme. There were a total of 10 magic guiding fairies, and each of them had an increase in magic attack and defense by 1,000 points. Just by relying on a field card, he could obtain such a huge improvement. This was extremely terrifying at any time. However, it was only because Vlad didn't have too many memories that he could use to suppress the vampire. The strength of the demon race did not come from nowhere. Magic was the foundation of their strength. Increasing one's strength, speed, and defense for a short period of time through buff magic was one of the basic elements of a battle. However, Vlad would not. If he was given more time to recover his memories, he would become even more difficult to deal with. Fortunately, that was not the case. Fairy Ibu joined the battle under Dake's command. She raised her head and began to sing the Song of Charm. Heartsuit, mesmerizing voice was activated, and while it dealt slight damage to the vampires, the mesmerizing effect of mesmerizing body was transformed into a voice that expanded to the vampires. As a female, Vlad was not completely immune to the charm effect of charming body. He suddenly became absent-minded in the midst of the fierce battle. In that instant, the Diru beast's cat claws pierced through his abdomen, and the shapeshifter's iron fist shattered his arm bone. Vlad woke up from his miserable screams. The blood that seeped out of his abdomen tried to repair the huge wound, but there was not enough blood or magic. Vlad clenched his fists in pain, the veins on his forehead popping out. His face was filled with panic, fear, regret, and many other emotions. His behavior was becoming more and more crazy. However, if one looked carefully, they would find that the depths of his eyes were becoming calmer. Some people would lose control when their emotions were intense. Some people were the exact opposite. Vlad belonged to the latter. Vampires were not that easy to kill. Garlic, crosses, holy water, silver ornaments. In history, humans had thought of countless ways to kill vampires, but most of them were only effective against blood thralls or blood demons. Orthodox vampires could even wear silver crosses and eat garlic dipped in holy water. Moreover, vampires could also turn into a group of bats. Each bat was their clone and contained all their genetic information. As long as the soul was attached to any bat, the vampire would be reborn. Vlad had obtained a new life by possessing the bat of an 8-star hidden boss, Vampire Count. After that, he used the Christmas Day ceremony as a sacrifice of blood and successfully resurrected. As for why his soul appeared in the secret passage, how long had it wandered in the secret passage, and why hadn't it dissipated yet? Even Vlad himself could not remember these things. However, the method of resurrection had given him guidance. Vlad desperately gasped for breath as his eyes swept across everyone present. No matter if it was Dake Dimming who had forced him into a desperate situation, or Betty, C. Keat White, and Luo Boat who were hiding in the surroundings with only half of their faces exposed. It was as if he wanted to engrave the faces of these people into his genes. That sharp gaze even made people feel pain. C. Keat and Luo Boat subconsciously retracted their heads. Ha! Vlad's body was covered in a bloody light as he once again forced the Dilu beast and the multiform monster to retreat. Then, like a proper villain with a business license, he let out a gloomy laugh. Do you know what a vampire is? Transcending life and death, transcending eternity, we awaken from corpses and return from the realm of the dead. We have never been alive, let alone die. Foolish humans. I, Vlad, will return. Before he finished speaking, Vlad's body suddenly expanded. From the original thin and long body to the later round and fat body, it only took 3 seconds. His 4 limbs swelled, his facial features changed, and the blood ball in the center of his body continued to expand, releasing an extremely dense bloody light. Self-destruction. This scene was so familiar. Dake's mind suddenly flashed back to the Halloween event where the 8-star hidden boss, Vampire Count's final farewell ceremony. The same result. The same self-destruction. Hide. Dake only had time to issue a final reminder. The bloody light dyed the entire world red. With Vlad's body as the center, the impact of the explosion spread to both sides of the secret passage, into the secret room, and to all the empty spaces. The sound of the explosion was so close that it almost made people's ears ring. The smell of blood filled the air. Betty C. Keat, White Luo Boat. The 4 of them instinctively shrank back, only to see the bloody wave rushing past them, crashing into the wall in front of them and splattering everywhere. Dake! The explosion that lasted for only a few seconds instantly subsided. C. Keat clutched her chest and gasped for breath. The other 3 hurriedly stuck their heads out, wanting to check on Dake's situation. Hundreds and thousands of bats suddenly flew past their eyes and into the crisscrossing secret passageways. Ah! Luo Boat violently slapped the bats in front of him, retreating in fear. White and Betty were also forced to shrink back. At the center of Vlad's explosion, Dake Dimming struggled to pry open the body of Polymorph's body, his heart still palpitating with fear. Vlad's self-destruction was not as terrifying as expected. This might have something to do with the fact that he used the last of his strength to create bats. But even so, Polymorph, who blocked all the damage at the critical moment, still had no magic power left, dissipating in the starlight. Dake took out the magic card Fantasy Beast. Polymorph tapped on the card surface and injected magic power. Thanks. Busy. Vlad's self-destruction was more like a pretense. He obviously wanted to escape, not die together. The bats scattered in the secret room would become the carriers for his rebirth. But the vampire's rebirth was not really that convenient. There were many factors to consider. But these had nothing to do with Dake. The vampire thought that he could escape, but he did not know that this was the territory of the Shangmalian Academy. Since he had already exposed himself, not a single bat could escape from here. Dake stood up straight, tidied his messy bangs, and regained his elegance. Chapter 218. When the last bat disappeared from sight, the surroundings gradually became quiet. White and Luo Boat looked at each other, then ran out of the secret room. The sudden appearance of the bats had put them in a difficult position, but the vampire's self-destruction was too frightening. They were worried about Dake's safety. But when they stepped out of the secret room, Dake's magic fairies had already rushed out and intimately gathered around Dake's feet. White was very envious of the fairies' high intelligence. Professor Cheong-si had explained some relevant knowledge in the dueling class at the end of the semester, but it wasn't something that a mere magus could touch upon. No one knew how Dake had done it. Even Professor Cheong-si had said that it wasn't something to be envious of. White took a deep breath. When he saw that Dake was fine, he leaned back against the wall and sat down. Whether it was his mental or physical strength, he had reached his limit. Luo Boat was still energetic. He looked around and asked Dake, "Are you okay?" Dake looked up. "I'm fine." Luo Boat, "What about the vampire? He won't come back, right?" Dake thought for a moment, then said, "Let's be careful. We should leave the secret passage tonight and tell the professors about the vampire's appearance as soon as possible. Oh, and Professor Shi Erfu should still be at school." Luo Boat quickly nodded. "That's what I thought too." The two of them then looked at Betty and Si Keet, who had come out from the other side of the room. Dake already knew that White and Betty were traveling together, but he hadn't seen their faces until now. He was familiar with Si Keet, but he had only seen her face once in the infirmary, so he didn't have much of an impression of her. Si Keet had been avoiding him all this while. Now that there was no way to avoid him, she said helplessly, "Dimming, why are you here?" Dake narrowed his eyes and thought of the mirror in the small secret room. He had an idea. "Maybe we entered the secret passage for the same reason." Si Keet asked in surprise, "You have a treasure map too?" Dake turned to Betty and asked, "Who is this senior?" "Hello, I'm Betty Murray from the School of Sorcery. You can just call me Betty," Betty said generously. Dake, "That won't do. Senior May, how did you encounter the vampire?" Betty still had a lingering fear in her heart. "I don't know. We just stayed here for the night. No one would have thought that there would be a vampire in this secret passage. I mean, we didn't realize we were being ambushed until White screamed." Speaking of which, Si Keet's face suddenly changed. She said with a trembling voice, "Wait, I heard that after being bitten by a vampire, you will become a vampire's servant." And White. Everyone's eyes instantly focused on White. Werther's body trembled. He subconsciously touched his neck, only to find that the wound on his neck had already healed, leaving only an inconspicuous scar. This actually scared him. "Is there really such a thing?" Betty quickly comforted him. "Not necessarily. Vampires will only turn their prey into a blood thrall during the embrace. If it's just a normal feeding, it won't happen." Dake nodded. "That's true. But we haven't seen a real vampire before. To be safe, we should take White to Sister Collien as soon as possible." White immediately stood up and said in a panic, "Then should we go now?" "Dake, let's not delay." Before leaving, Dake went back to the dragon's lair to take a look. Sure enough, this secret realm was showing signs of collapsing. "I wanted to go on another trip." Dake was disappointed. But when he thought about how he had drawn every scene, he was glad. Maybe this was life. The journey was full of scenery. When he looked back, there were only remnants of memories. After Dake packed up his things, he walked out of the small secret room. The collapse of the dragon's lair had obviously affected this small secret room. Standing in the secret room, one could even feel the tremors like an earthquake. But once they left the secret room, there was nothing left. The five of them witnessed the disappearance of the secret room. Then they set off on their journey home with mixed feelings. Along the way, they didn't encounter any other danger except for a few bats. White was exhausted halfway back. He had to summon magical fantasy beast Stag to travel. Keat and Betty didn't have much stamina either. They walked and stopped for a while. Finally they left the secret passage before 8 in the morning. At this moment, everyone was exhausted beyond belief. But in order to completely resolve their worries, they dragged their tired bodies and knocked on the door of the infirmary. Sister Kalyen finally had a good night's sleep. She didn't want to be woken up by the noise. She didn't look well when she opened the door. But when she learned that White had been bitten by a vampire, she immediately said, "Come in first." Sister Kalyen put White on the bed. First she checked the bite wound on his neck. Then she applied alcohol to disinfect it and took out a needle to draw blood. She dripped the blood on a petri dish. Then she made a temporary reagent and dripped it into the petri dish for testing. The reagent reacted with the blood and emitted light of 7 colors. After checking the spectrum, Sister Kalyen finally relaxed. Luckily, there are no signs of blood enslavement. She put down her tools, took off her gloves and washed her hands. Then she turned around and said, "Tell me, where did you run into the vampire?" Dake talked to Betty and the other two for a while. Then he said, "In the secret passage." Sister Kalyen looked at them and asked curiously, "Is it over?" Dake shook his head. "Not yet." He turned into a swarm of bats and fled to various places in the secret passage. Crossing her arms, Sister Kalyen rested her chin on her hand and pondered. He turned into bats and fled. That's what vampires usually do. But don't worry. I've already notified Professor Shi-Erfu. She'll be here soon. If it's true, you might get bonus points. Dake asked in surprise. "Can we get bonus points for doing that?" Sister Kalyen smiled. "We discovered a hidden danger in the secret passage and even successfully repelled it. Why can't we get bonus points?" Dake said, "But last time," Sister Kalyen asked, "you didn't." Dake said, "Nope." Sister Kalyen shrugged. "Maybe you can look forward to the opening ceremony of the new semester. Arte always liked to store up some things, and then choose a grand time to light them up personally, just like setting off fireworks. You have to know that ever since that incident, she hasn't come back yet." "Did I spill the beans?" Dake said solemnly. "No, sister. I didn't hear anything." Sister Kalyen patted his shoulder and said kindly, "If you're tired, you can lie down inside first. I have sleeping potions here. Okay, you can use them after the report." Before she could finish, a gust of wind blew in through the window. Professor Shi-Erfu arrived with the wind and immediately said, "Let's report it now." Chapter 219. Professor Shi-Erfu's face was as serious as ever. However, Dake could feel that her gaze towards him was slightly different. This made Dake a little embarrassed. After all, he did give her an unpleasant gift at Christmas. Fortunately, Professor Shi-Erfu was a person who separated public from private interests and did not say much about it. Dake then described in detail the reason why he entered the secret passage and the process and result of his encounter with the vampire. He did not hide the fact that he used the Paradise card to defeat the vampire Vlad. Although the school prohibited professors from giving students magic cards for free, even if it was a semi-finished product, it was still the same. However, by Christmas, Claire had already left her job, so it could be said that he had perfectly avoided this rule. In addition, the card was made by Dake himself, so it did not violate the handmade rule. The only thing left was the moral aspect. Therefore, Claire specifically stated that he could not use the Paradise card on events related to the competition. The first website was https://vipcanshu. VIP. Moreover, special circumstances were special. Professor Shi Erfu was not an unreasonable person. She did not say much in this regard. Instead, she showed a considerable degree of appreciation for Dake's actions. Then, her face became gloomy at a speed visible to the naked eye. I remember that I specifically reminded you that the secret room is very dangerous and is forbidden to enter. Especially White and Luo Boat. You just came out of confinement. The change in atmosphere was so fast that White and Luo Boat did not have time to react. White was originally sleepy, but she suddenly woke up. Luo Boat subconsciously shrank his neck. C. Keat's face was not looking too good either. Only Betty retorted, "Professor Shi Erfu, that's not a rule, and it's a holiday right now." Shi Erfu: "Yes, so I'll only deduct 50 points from each of you." Betty: "Professor, that's not fair. Sister Kalyen didn't say that." Kalian coughed. "Ahem." Sylph glared at her fiercely and said, "That's one thing, that's one thing. In view of the fact that you discovered the vampires, you have indeed done a meritorious service. After I find out the truth, I will give you extra points as compensation. This matter can be considered cancelled out. It's fine as long as you don't deduct points." White gradually lay flat on the bed, and her eyelids began to fight again. Professor Shi Erfu continued, "As for the fact that Dake defeated the vampire and saved the four of you, I'll explain it to the principal and then announce the reward." Dake couldn't help but smile. It seemed like he would be able to subsidize the materials for Fusion and Zoo. Professor Shi Erfu said, "You'd better rest well in the infirmary and let Sister Kalyen check your physical condition. We will take care of the following matters properly." When Professor Shi Erfu disappeared into the wind again, Dake could not help but look envious. Whether it was the principal's teleportation-like entrance or Professor Shi Erfu's way of moving as wind, they were both very enviable. When would he be able to master a spell of the same level? As he thought about it, he suddenly felt tired after a sleepless night. Dake yawned, found a bed, and lay down. Soon he closed his eyes. C. Keat, Luo Boat, and Betty did the same. Soon they all fell asleep. Sister Kalyen shook the sleeping potion in her hand and heated it up with magic power. The potion evaporated and helped Dake and the others fall into a deep sleep. Then, she carefully examined the 5 of them. After confirming that they had no internal or external injuries, she was finally relieved. They encountered vampires in the 1st grade and were not injured. I wonder if they were unlucky or lucky. She returned to her desk, sat down, and looked out of the window. This year's winter was particularly unusual. When Dake woke up, he realized that he had missed a lot of big news in the past few days while exploring the secret passage. He leaned on the bed, eating the dinner brought by the little demon beast while reading the 2 days of the Great Sage daily. He could not help but sigh. It's Christmas indeed. Compared to the small fights in school, the outside world was much more lively. December 25th, midnight. While all the people in the kingdom were celebrating the arrival of Christmas, the Badia prison under the jurisdiction of the saint was attacked by a heretic group. In order to maintain stability, the saint did not release the news until the day after Christmas. Then, it was immediately condemned by the kingdom's famous officials. The saint claimed that the prison's defense was very strong and that all the heretics who invaded the prison had been eliminated. No one survived. However, those who were not very fond of the saint took the opportunity to criticize them. They firmly believed that the saint must have concealed the news. Otherwise, they would not have released the news until 48 hours after the incident. The reason for blocking the news was to maintain stability. However, if all the heretics were eliminated, it would undoubtedly be an exciting event. It should be promoted as a festive event. Therefore, the saint must be lying about this matter. Such discussions became more and more intense, and the kingdom's newspapers were full of related speculations. The core reason for such an uproar was that most of the prisoners in the Badia prison were ferocious war criminals. There were even some demi-humans who had mixed blood with demons. Dake temporarily put down the newspaper and drank the last mouthful of soup. He then put the cutlery in the basket and let the little demon beast take it back. White and the others kept looking at him. It seemed that they also wanted to eat, but the little demon beast was only responsible for one person's meal, so he could only apologize. The appearance of vampires in the Shangmalian Academy's secret passage should have been a big deal. But now that the saint was in danger, it was already good that the Academy did not kick them when they were down. The saint probably could not even take care of themselves. The Sage Daily also mentioned that the kingdom had strongly intervened in this matter, and wanted to conduct a thorough investigation of the Badia prison. Of course, the Dove faction was involved. For a time, all kinds of rumors were spreading. Some prophets who wanted to see the world in chaos even crazily added drama to themselves. They said that the demon king would be resurrected, causing panic among the people. Dake did not know the truth and did not want to make wild guesses. However, the prophet's predictions were not all sensationalism. The demon king would be resurrected sooner or later. But in what form would he be resurrected in? Another half an hour passed. Sister Kalyen returned from outside with news that was neither good nor bad. Professor Shi Erfu had always been swift and decisive. After leaving this morning, he immediately gathered the professors who were still in the school and conducted a thorough search of the secret passage. With a bat tracker made by Professor Kazair, they only took a day to kill all the bats in the secret passage. However, Vlad was not among the bats that were killed. This meant that there were two possibilities. 1. Vlad was not possessed. 2. Vlad was able to evade the professor's search after possessing a bat. The first possibility was more likely. The soul was a forbidden zone. Magisters were still very inexperienced in the study of souls. If Vlad was not possessed by a bat and continued to wander about as a soul, then it would be very difficult to find him. However, a soul could wander about in the mortal world for a maximum of 168 hours. Ordinary souls would dissipate within 24 hours. During this time, the soul would gradually weaken with the passage of time. Its self-awareness would also quickly disappear, and it would become a soulless ghost. If Vlad could not find a bat to possess within 168 hours, then he would not have the chance to be resurrected. However, this was only an inference under normal circumstances. Vlad's soul was not ordinary. The second possibility was almost zero. However, if it was in the secret passage, then perhaps there was a hidden place that even the professors could not find. In order to deal with this, the professors had sealed all the entrances and exits of the secret passage and had stationed golems to guard them. Not long after Sister Kalyen returned, Professor Shi Erfu's notice popped up in Dake and the others' academy cards. From the moment the notice was sent out, the secret passage would become a forbidden zone. If anyone was found to have entered the secret passage, they would be expelled immediately. Such a strict ban was very rare in Shangmalian history. This meant that there was no possibility of cheating. If you wanted to challenge the Academy's tolerance limit, then congratulations, now was the time equals. After learning the result, Dake and the others did not stay in the infirmary any longer. After thanking Sister Kalyen, they left the infirmary one after another. Dake went straight back to the dormitory. After not seeing each other for 3 days, he realized that he missed the catnip plants. The catnip plants thought the same and came over to him as soon as they saw him. Dake squatted down and picked up all 3 catnip plants. After a long time, he remembered to open paradise and summon the magic elves one by one. The dormitory suddenly felt a little warmer. Dake took off his clothes and brought the 3 catnip plants into the bathroom. He washed off the dust and took a bath himself. The garbage slime had crawled to the edge of the bathtub and he grabbed it and put it on his face. Superficial. Overall, he had gained a lot from this treasure hunt. Not only did he see rare sceneries, but he also obtained the Valkyrie's alchemy array and even practiced with vampires. Especially after it was over, the academy helped to clean up. There was no better Christmas present than this. Dake thought happily. This was the only year that Yvette did not give him a Christmas present. He had no choice but to take it himself. Unlike Dake, Luo Boat parted ways with Yvette after leaving the infirmary. It was not that he wanted to separate, but Yvette chose to travel with the church. Everyone had their own ambitions. Luo Boat could do nothing about it. In any case, he could not be with Si Keet. Luo Boat was born in a military family and had mixed in with a group of veterans since childhood. He had been taught to distinguish between kindness and hatred, to seek revenge, to do what should be done, and not to be so stubborn. It was just that since school started, he and Yvette had been inseparable. Now that they were going their separate ways, he felt a little lonely. He came to the tower of the Knight Academy and nodded to the statue of the knight guarding the tower. The old knight smiled kindly and opened the tower door. Luo Boat walked into the common room and watched the two seniors play chess for a while. He could not help but say a few words and was chased away. He laughed and slipped up the stairs, opened the door and entered the dormitory, then sat by the bed for a long time. What is Yvette doing now? Is it fun to be with Si Keet and the others? Speaking of which, what is the name of the church? He rambled on for a long time before remembering that it was time to take a bath. But after taking a bath, he had nothing to do again. He could only take out the magic chess he bought the first time he went to Traveler Street, play with the chess pieces, and then play chess with himself. In the past, when he stayed at home, he could play for a long time by himself. But tonight for some reason he was tired after 10 minutes. What's going on? Why is it so boring? What's so interesting about it? For the first time, the 12-year-old boy learned to be sentimental. Then, he suddenly realized that he had nothing except for the magic chess. If it's Yvette, what will he do? What if it's Dake? What about AI Ma? What do they do when they're alone? Luo Boat could not help but start thinking. Imitation was the nature of intelligent life. Especially when they were children. When their personalities and habits were not set. They were easily influenced by the people around them. Luo Boat could not think of what Yvette would do, but his eyes rolled and he thought of what Dake and AI Ma would do. Read a book. A strange voice quietly sounded from the bottom of his heart. Read a book. Luo Boat suddenly had the urge to read a book. He stood up abruptly and walked to the desk. Then his whole body was suddenly stunned. There are no books. Other than textbooks. He did not have any books. Textbooks are fine too. Forget about textbooks. Luo Boat shook his head and shrank back on the bed. So boring. F***ck. The church had a gathering tonight. There were two purposes for the gathering. One was because Yvette and the other two had just returned from the secret passage, and the other members of the church wanted to hear about their adventures. This kind of gathering together to listen to stories seemed very normal, but it was very rare for the members of the church. They also wanted to experience that feeling. The other purpose was to give the church a name. The new year was a new atmosphere. No one liked to stay in the dark all the time. The members of the church reached a consensus that they would change their appearance in the new year and walk on the stage as a society. In order to achieve their goal, they first needed a flag. Now they had this flag. Then they needed a name. Previously, although they all called themselves the Church of the Goddess, they had not officially named it. And that name could not be used anymore. There had to be a new name that could be recognized by the school. 2 in 1 4,000 words. 1 collecting the name of a church, 2 collecting the leather cover of white, 3 collecting the monthly votes. Chapter 220. Late at night. After Dake took care of everything, he got into bed, took the notebook beside the bed, and opened it on the blanket. Other than the Diru beast and the little fiend beast, the other magic guide fairies all came over. Even the cat Grass squeezed to Dake's side with a curious expression. Dake started flipping from the beginning, and compared it with the treasure map in his hand, recalling the corresponding scenery of each landmark. Because it was just a sketch, many of the scenery that required color to be displayed seemed relatively ordinary. However, the magic guide fairies were at the stage where they were curious about everything, and they all looked at it with relish. Only the little fiend beast and the Diru beast, who had accompanied him along the way, stood on the top of the bird rack and cabinet, looking down at the magic guide fairies who were crying out. Their eyes were filled with a sense of superiority. After flipping to the last map of the dragon cave, Dake looked at the magic guide fairies around him and suddenly had the mood to tell a story. Thus he took a pen and drew while telling a story. Remember the website, Vipkanshu. VIP. He told some familiar fairy tales, mixed with a few educational fables. Gradually, Dake found that they were listening more and more seriously, even more seriously than when they were looking at the scenery. A thought quietly appeared in his mind. The next morning, Dake didn't know when he fell asleep. In short, when he woke up, he found that the bed was full of petite and cute magic guide fairies. Even the Diru beast, which occasionally looked very unsociable, was curled up beside him, looking very cute with its furry hair. Dake tried his best to get out of bed carefully. After washing up, he began to prepare for today's itinerary. There were still 3 days before the end of the holiday. In these 3 days, he didn't plan to do any more academic research. Fusion, zoo, and Arvet's refining array were all put aside for the time being. He still needed to confirm with the professors about the refining array. However, the professors were still busy with the vampires, so it wasn't the time. In short, everything would continue after school started. These 3 days were just right for him to relax. So, who's going out with me today? Dake sat down and said to his magic elf. Apart from the little fiend that was squatting on the bird stand with a smug look on its face, the rest of the 10 magic guide fairies were lined up in front of Dake, raising their heads in anticipation. Dake had given them a spot in the team, but they had to fight for it themselves. Hurry up! Multiform was the first to speak. However, it raised the trash slime above its head, indicating that it wanted to help its baby fight for the spot. But the trash slime slipped out of its hand like jelly. The multiform monster then covered his head and pretended that nothing had happened. Among Dake's magical spirits, Trash Slime was the only one that didn't have much self-awareness. Naturally, it was excluded from this competition. Among the remaining 8 magic guide fairies, the multiform monster expressed that it was not interested. Chocho wanted to stay in the bathtub. Huhu was very confident in its movement speed and wanted to sunbathe on the balcony. In the end, only 5 magic guide fairies were left. They were Ibu, Hawkman Wrestling, Dilu Beast, Fairy Ibu, and Big Milk Can. Squeak, squeak, squeak. Ibu was just about to raise its hand when it was lifted up by Fairy Ibu with its ribbon antennae. As Ibu's evolved form, Fairy Ibu undoubtedly had a strong deterrent force like a big sister in front of Ibu. Thus, the competitor -1. Yoshi. Seeing that there were fewer and fewer competitors, the Hawkman Wrestling immediately puffed up its chest and patted it hard, indicating that it had nothing but brute force. As long as it was brought along, it could take anything. Perhaps this was the confidence of a fight-type fairy. Unfortunately, before it could show its strength, 2 more ribbons hung down from the sky, one on the left and one on the right, wrapping around its wings and suddenly lifting it up. Lucy yo! But the Hawkman Wrestling was not as powerless as Ibu. It immediately gathered its strength and struggled hard. For a moment, it was entangled with Fairy Ibu. On the other side, the Dilu Beast was still standing at the side with a cold expression. Big Milk Can looked around and suddenly found that there was no opponent. It happily went to Dake's feet and raised its head to call out softly. The Dilu Beast looked at the shameless cow and the corner of its mouth twitched. Fairy Ibu saw that it had lost its position and fiercely used its strength to throw the Hawkman Wrestling away. Then it jumped up and seized Dake's other knee. Dake rubbed the heads of the two magic guide fairies and revealed a helpless smile. Then we'll add one more person. Little evil magic beast. Count the things that everyone wants to buy. 8 o'clock in the morning. Dake brought the little evil magic beast, big milk can, and Fairy Ibu into Traveler Street. Because there were suddenly 9 more people in the dormitory, there were a lot of necessities that needed to be bought. He looked at the shopping list in his hand and prepared to go to the furniture store first. Traveler Street still had the lingering charm of Christmas. Colorful lights and Christmas trees full of presents were everywhere. Little things that looked like coal balls were huddled in the corner of the street, shivering in the cold wind. Dake curiously walked over. Just the vibration of his footsteps woke them up, and they immediately dived into the sewers in a panic. Is this a dust fairy? Dake had seen a description of this mysterious animal in the book that Claire had specified. Secret records of birds and beasts. Strange unknown ecology. However, it had appeared as food for the ash cat. Dust fairies, as the name implied, fed on dust and garbage. Every holiday, a large amount of garbage would appear on Traveler Street. Someone would call these little things to clean the street. Carrot Omega Carrot. Fairy Ibu used a ribbon to wrap around Dake's arm, hinting that he should go. There weren't many furniture stores in Traveler Street. The main reason was that the student dormitory's furniture was luxurious enough. Even if it was damaged, it could be replaced. Students didn't have a high demand for furniture, and things like pots and pans could be bought in grocery stores. Dake looked for a long time before finding a custom furniture store. He went straight to the boss and handed over his design drawing. 4 beds for 3 and a large cat tree. The boss looked at the design and was a little surprised. You're raising cats in the dormitory. Then he looked down at Fairy Ibu and the milk jar, the corners of his mouth twitching. You wouldn't be custom-made for a magic fairy, right? Dake nodded with a smile. Can I? Boss. 3 beds each one. 5 meters long, 1 meter wide and 2 meters high. Each bed has 3 floors, so there are 4 beds in total. 12 beds, covering an area of 6 square meters. The cat tree takes up an area of 2 by 3, which is also 6 square meters. Is there anything else? Dake thought for a moment. Can I custom make a wooden dummy? Boss. A wooden dummy. Dake drew a design for a wooden dummy on the spot. Originally, the horned hawk had wanted a sandbag, but Dake felt that it wasn't safe to put a sandbag in the dormitory. Instead, it was better to make a wooden dummy on the balcony. After the boss received the design, he looked at it for a moment and realized something. Good stuff, but it's not hard to make. Dake. Also, can I custom make 12 sets of pillows, mattresses, sheets, and bedding according to the size of the bed? The boss immediately smiled. Course, that's no problem. If you're not in a hurry, you can choose the materials and styles of the furniture here. I have a few materials and patterns here. When Dake came out of the furniture store, it was already close to noon. He asked the little fiend and the other 2 magic fairies for their opinions and chose the materials and styles. In addition, he also provided the little fiend and 10 magic fairies card designs. These were used to custom-make pillowcases, sheets, and bedding covers. As for the other 2 sets of the 12, they were kept as backups. This way, the main purpose of today's visit was completed. According to the boss of the furniture store, he could pick up the goods tomorrow afternoon. Dake came to the restaurant and ordered a cup of bloody tomato juice for the little fiend and a cup of green milk tea for the milk jar. Then, according to Fairy Ibu's strong request, he ordered a couple's cup of loving buffet and ate it with 2 spoons. Eating buffet in the winter feels really good. Dake also shared a fruit salad with the magic fairies, and this lunch was considered over. Next, he started to buy some necessities for the magic fairies according to the shopping list. In order to store those things, he rented a small trailer and had the milk jar pull it. Of course, it had to be pulled while standing. In the end, Dake came to a bookstore. The bookstore was called Happy Bookstore, and sold some supplementary teaching materials that the school didn't provide. Under the strange gaze of the shop assistant, Dake chose some children's teaching materials, mainly reading and writing materials and fun books for beginners. Yes, that's right. Dake was preparing to give a lesson to the magic fairies at home. This was perhaps a pioneering work that had never been done before. Dake suddenly had this idea when he was telling a story last night. Since his magic fairies had unusually high intelligence, why couldn't he let them improve themselves through learning? Fairy Ivan's use of the sure-kill skill Moon Force in the dragon's nest to create a bright beam of light was a very good example. If it were other magic fairies, they would at most be able to adjust the direction and breadth of their sure-kill skill, but they wouldn't be able to use it as flexibly as Ivan. Then, using this as a foundation, he could extend it further. Since Fairy Ivan was able to use the Moon Force so flexibly, could it use the same energy to achieve other effects? For example, transforming the Moon Force into a wall? Or adding a point to its head and turning it into a moon blade? If it could do that, wouldn't it be equivalent to having two new sure-kill skills? Taking it a step further, could it learn magic that used the Moon Force as its source? Although the difficulty of learning magic was very high, and even humans with magic talent would find it hard to become a qualified magician. But if Fairy Ivan's intelligence wasn't inferior to humans, and they could use magic, then wouldn't it be possible to learn magic? Even if it was very difficult, as long as it was possible, it was worth trying. And if one wanted to learn magic, they had to first grasp the corresponding knowledge. In addition, even if it wasn't for the sake of increasing one's strength, it was purely from the perspective of nurturing a bond. Although Dake had paradise could only be opened in a fixed place. Even if a human were to stay in a small place, they would still get sick from holding it in. Magic fairies could sleep on their own within the magic card, but after being summoned, they could only sleep. But if the magic fairies had received basic education, they could read, and even play chess. Then their spiritual life would gradually become richer. Even if they stayed at home, they could still find fun. Dake had learned many things from Claire's lessons, but regarding how to nurture a bond with a magic fairy, he only had one word for it, and that was sincerity. Why was Anna able to subconsciously nurture a bond with a magic fairy? It was because she liked bears from the bottom of her heart, and her love for those magic fairies wasn't mixed with the slightest bit of distracting thoughts. Only by treating a magic fairy with sincerity would the magic fairy treat you with sincerity. This was a natural process. Therefore, some magisters would deliberately create bonds in order to become stronger, but it would instead have the opposite effect. Dake's current situation was actually the same. The first thing he had to do was to adjust his mentality and dilute some of his utilitarian thoughts. 3:00 in the afternoon. Dake returned to the dormitory with big and small bags. The magic fairies that were originally bored to death in the dormitory suddenly became lively. The Diru beast jumped down from the top of the cabinet and appeared at the entrance. But in the end, it didn't say the words, "Welcome home." With the help of the magic fairies, Dake put down all the big and small bags, and then according to the shopping list, distributed one item to each of the magic fairies. The sandbag that the Hawkman wanted was changed to a wooden dummy, and it would only arrive tomorrow. The shapeshifter wanted a small mirror, and Dake directly bought a set. The Chocho sea lion wanted a bigger water basin, and Dake bought it a small air cushion swimming pool. The kettle wanted a teacup, and Dake bought a new tea set. As for Ivan, the Diru beast, the fairy Ivan, and the big milk jar, they all wanted a scarf. The little fiend personally helped to choose a scarf. Although its heart was bleeding at that time, it had no choice but to follow its master's task. Fortunately, after the task was completed, it received a new hat, which made it happy again. The weather in winter was getting colder and colder, and only a familiar like it who could go out often needed such a warm hat. Beautiful. The magic fairies received what they wanted, so they were naturally very excited. Dake waited until they calmed down, and then distributed the teaching materials and reading books to each of them. The magic fairies held the teaching materials with a stupefied expression, and looked at their master as if they were looking at an idiot. But they will soon find out who is the real idiot equals. For the rest of the holiday, apart from spending some time on the bed, the cat tree, and the wooden dummy, Dake spent most of his time teaching the magic fairies. Even the little fiend wasn't able to escape from Teacher Dake's teaching. Room 201 of the aristocrat house was miserable. 2 in 1/4/100. Chapter 221. Teaching people to read and write from zero was a very difficult task. Not to mention teaching magic elves. In order to better arouse the enthusiasm of the magic engineering fairies, stimulate their enthusiasm for learning, and comprehensively evaluate the learning state of the magic engineering fairies. Room 201 of the noble house's tower had specially set up a little red flower reward and punishment system. Through good grades, hard work, and obvious improvement, magic elves would be encouraged in the form of little red flowers to help them develop good learning habits. If their performance was bad, little red flowers would be deducted as a warning to others. At the same time, little red flowers were included in the internal currency system. Magic elves could use little red flowers to buy wishes. Whether it was material wishes or spiritual wishes, as long as enough little red flowers were paid, Dake would try his best to satisfy them. In the beginning, the magic elves might not take it seriously, but once someone started using little red flowers to make a wish and was satisfied, everything would change. Dake had a certain amount of expectations for this. 1 second to remember https://m. Vipkanshu. Vapa the night of the 31st of December. Dark stuffed each of the elves into a small bed and covered them with a cute little blanket. Only then did he crawl into his own bed with satisfaction. The first long holiday of the first year passed in the blink of an eye. Tomorrow was the beginning of the new year, and also the beginning of the next semester. That being said, there was actually no class tomorrow. Some of the students and professors who went home during the holiday would rush back tomorrow. The school would hold a ceremony at 6 in the evening, and then all the teachers and students would have dinner together in the auditorium. At that time, the principal would summarize the situation of the previous semester and introduce the new professor of the history of magic. Professor Claire seemed to have confirmed that she would no longer be on duty, but there was almost no news about the new professor. Based on the good impression that Professor Claire brought, the students were very much looking forward to the new professor. Dake was also very curious. System, expand the indicators. Before going to bed, he called out the system panel. A moment later, 7 indicators appeared in his field of vision. Compared with the end of last month, it was Pride, 106-105, Envy, 41-39, Fury, 90-88, Sloth, 64-69, Greed, 97-103, Gluttony, 64-69, Bliss, 109-106. Even though a total of 12 bliss points and 3 pride points were drawn in December, the overall value was still increasing. Among them, pride gained another 2 points after 3 points were taken, returning to 105 points. This was unavoidable. The continuous decline of envy was also within his expectations. With the help of the cat grass, fury had also decreased. Sloth and gluttony were still rebounding. Greed's increase was also within his expectations, and part of it was intentional. As for bliss, after a total of 12 points were drawn, bliss still rose to 106 points. This meant that it had increased by a total of 9 points in December. Dake had already expected this outcome. Moreover, he had indeed relaxed his restraint this month. But in general, these values were still within a controllable range. He closed his eyes and thought for a moment. A new January was coming, and 15 points of great sins could be extracted in January. There was still 1 point of pride stored in the worm tree. However, judging from the current situation, his need for great sins wasn't urgent. He could save up this month's pride and bliss for the upcoming Pride 3 or Bliss V. Also, he could finally put his research on greed on the agenda. He really wanted to know what changes would happen to the little fiend monster when it was in the state of greed. Would it reveal some of its greedy nature as a fiend monster? As he thought about it, Dake could not help but smirk. Then he fell asleep in a daze. 10 minutes later, his breathing gradually stabilized, and he gradually fell into a deep sleep. However, on the small bed against the wall, a few magic guide fairies quietly opened their eyes. The warm small bed and the cute quilt could not stop the war from starting. In the dark and cold night, only by the side of their master could they feel warmth. When Dake opened his eyes, he realized that there were a few more furry and warm bodies beside him. He helplessly covered his forehead and suddenly felt that he should not have ordered a 3-tiered small bed. Maybe it would be a better idea to make a bigger bed. What was the phrase, sleeping together with a big quilt? January 1st, Monday, 7 a.m. Dake took out his breakfast from the basket and took out today's Great Sage Daily. Then, he rewarded the little fiend monster with a little red flower. The little fiend monster, who had been defeated last night, suddenly had a big smile on its face. The little red flower is the first little red flower after the implementation of the reward and punishment system. I, the little fiend monster, accept it. Dake helplessly shook his head and then opened the Great Sage Daily. He paid special attention to the newspaper for the past 2 days. The impact caused by the invasion of Badia prison by the heretics was still fermenting. In this incident, the Shangmalian Academy still did not express any views on this matter. The Dove faction led by Princess Elisha wanted to conduct a comprehensive investigation in the name of the kingdom. However, they were obstructed by the Eagle faction led by First Prince Charles. However, this kind of 300 taels of silver here behavior confirmed the speculation that the Holy Church was lying. Some newspapers that were biased towards the Dove faction began to report this matter, and severely condemned the Holy Church for hiding the truth. However, this so-called condemnation was limited to words. The Holy Church was a transcendental force that was comparable to the Shangmalian Academy. Its history was even longer than the kingdom. For a long time before the Shangmalian Academy entered the world, the Holy Church even controlled the power of the kingdom. If it were not for the mediocre performance at the end of the war and thus losing the support of the people, the Holy Church would be even more powerful. Even so, the Holy Church still occupied many seats in the House of Lords. Now that the king was old and the royal family was weak, only the faction of the Valkyrie could compete with the Holy Church. Not to mention the position just looking at this incident from the perspective of a bystander. Dake was more inclined to believe that the Holy Church was hiding something. The heretics who invaded the prison might have been killed as they said, but some important prisoners in the prison might have escaped due to the chaos. Otherwise, the Holy Church would not have been so tight-lipped and even needed Prince Charles to interfere with the kingdom's investigation. This incident was definitely unusual. He had a vague feeling that something was going to happen. Could it be related to the resurrection of the Demon King? Dake carefully thought about it and felt that it was not impossible. If the Holy Church's mistake was big enough to cause the resurrection of the Demon King, then it was no wonder that they chose to hide it. After breakfast, Dake continued to teach the magic elves how to read. Among all the magic elves, the little demon beast and the Dilu beast were undoubtedly the fastest to learn. Their advantage of being able to speak human language was very helpful for reading and writing. Trash Slimes, on the other hand, had basically been removed from the kindergarten class. The other one at the bottom was the Hawkman, who could not sit still at all. It only wanted to compete with the wooden dummies. Teaching people to read was originally a very boring thing. However, teaching his own magic guiding fairies to learn how to read was surprisingly very interesting. Dake was never tired of it. The magic elves were miserable. After lunch break, Dake also received Deanna and Luosi, who dropped by. The two little girls looked as if they had seen ghosts when they saw the magic elves sitting in a row and practicing writing. Deanna was stunned for a long time, then suddenly summoned her panda familiar and stuffed a pen into its claws. But the poor familiar grabbed the pen and scribbled randomly, and was severely scolded. Luosi looked at Deanna, who was desperately making things difficult for her familiar, and couldn't help but twitch the corner of her mouth. Because she couldn't help but have a similar thought. Is this the difference in intelligence level? What should I do to raise the intelligence level of the magic elves to 3.0? No, 3.0 isn't enough. A magic elven that can read and write. Ugh, this is too exaggerated. Luosi stuffed herself into the lounge chair, indicating that she didn't see anything. 5:45 in the afternoon. After Dake gave the magic elves homework, he went out of the tower with Deanna and Luosi and walked towards the auditorium on the first floor of the castle. Along the way, Deanna couldn't stop sighing. She was very reluctant to part with the holiday that was about to pass. But the fluttering singing soon dispelled her sadness. She hummed along with the singing, closed her eyes, and followed the aroma of the desserts into the auditorium. It was almost 6 o'clock in the evening, and the castle had already fallen into darkness. Thousands of candles floating in the air lit up the entire auditorium. Colored ribbons with wings were flying in the air, sprinkling some star-like debris on the people they met. The 4 long tables in the auditorium were as gorgeous as ever. The golden plates and silver goblets on the tables reflected the colorful light. Just like the moment when the memory was awakened, standing on the stage and seeing the scene. Just like a classic copy, it poured into Dake's mind. In the blink of an eye, it's already the second semester. Dake walked towards the long table that represented the aristocratic academy. Recalling the panic when he first entered the school, Dake's expression became more and more relaxed. In the span of 4 months, his growth could not be said to be small. Looking back, it was to the extent that he didn't even dare to think about. Sure enough, if people didn't force themselves, they would never know where their limits were. As the whole school's teachers and students entered the auditorium one after another, the atmosphere in the auditorium rose to a peak. The lively atmosphere dispelled the coldness of winter. The gathering on the first day of the new year made the students gradually forget the melancholy of the upcoming school term. Welcome back to Shangmalian Academy. The clock at 6 o'clock quietly rang. The velvety soft and silky black curtain slowly parted. The most beautiful and noble lady of Shangmalian Academy, Principal Cynthiacy. Aertii once again stepped on the stage. The 9 fairies surrounding Principal Aertii transformed into flowers and fireflies, rendering the stage dreamy and beautiful. It was confirmed that this was the real Principal Aertii. Dake carefully counted and confirmed that the 9 fairies were all present, so he knew what was going on. It seemed that Principal Aertii had rushed back before the opening ceremony. Then what about Senior Panduola? Would she be able to make it back in time? Dake subconsciously stretched his neck to look in the direction of the 4th year of the Magical Academy, but he didn't see that familiar figure. It seems that Senior Sister is going to take a leave of absence. I wonder where she went. Who went where? Deanna suddenly asked. Dake shook his head. Who do you think the new History of Magic professor will be? Deanna pouted and thought for a while, then whispered, I think it will be a sage. Luosi interrupted. Maybe a hero? Dake said helplessly. You want to tear Claire in half, don't you? Deanna was about to talk back when she heard Principal Aertii's words. She quickly poked Dake's waist and said, Dake, they mentioned you. Dake. Yes. On the stage. Principal Aertii followed the procedures of the opening ceremony and praised and rewarded the outstanding students of the previous semester. When it came to the first-year students, of course, Dake Dimming was included. Principal Aertii's tone was full of joy. Mr. Diming's outstanding performance is without a doubt the biggest surprise among the new students. If it weren't for the fact that the first year didn't have a class leader, he would be the best candidate. Whether it was his identity as the winner of the Crimson Star or his performance in the Moon God incident, he deserved to be called the best student of the first year. Let's see what the professors say about him. First, Professor Shi Erfu. Oh, very good. Yes, very good. Professor Shi Erfu concisely used one word to give Mr. Dimming the best evaluation. Next, Professor Ka Zayer. Me see. Dake Dimming is the most talented student I have ever seen. He is a natural-born magic card maker. TSK Professor Kazair actually gave him such a high evaluation. Seems that they have a good relationship. Next, Professor Li. He will win the Merlin Prize in the field of arithmetic. I can't say anything more about Professor Li's evaluation. Next, let's see what the other professors say about him. Professor Thompson said that he has a calmer heart than anyone else. Professor Cheong-si is looking forward to him winning the dual championship before he graduates. Professor Claire. Yes, very cute. Yes, our Mr. Dimming is indeed very cute. Suddenly, a wave of kind laughter came from below the stage. Dake could clearly feel that no matter if it was a boy or a girl, they were all looking in his direction. Even if he was as thick-skinned as a city wall. His face was now slightly red. Principal Aertii paused for a moment and continued. The unanimous evaluation of the professors says it all. But here I want to announce one more thing. Just a few days ago during the holidays, Mr. Dimming relied on his wisdom and courage to save the lives of 4 students by accident. Although this is a confidential matter, I can't help but want to say it. For this, including the reward for the Moon God incident, I will reward him with 10,000 academic credits and a chance to make a wish in the Holy Grail. 2 in 14/100. Chapter 222. Holy Grail. As soon as Principal Aertii finished his words, the discussion among the teachers and students suddenly increased by a decibel. The reward of 10,000 credits was secondary, but the chance to make a wish with the Holy Grail was quite exceptional. As one of the 3 greatest wishing artifacts in the world, this Shangmalian Holy Grail could collect the power of wishes and fulfill the wishes of the person making the wish. The Christmas stocking that the students received on Christmas Eve was a one-time wishing artifact made from the Shangmalian Holy Grail. Although Dake's Christmas stocking only yielded an apple, the rest of the students seemed to have gotten very good gifts. A Christmas stocking was already so good, not to mention the Holy Grail itself. At the end of every semester, the school would calculate the school championship competition based on the total credits of the 4 branches. Every student of the branch that won the school championship competition would have a chance to make a wish. This meant that every student had a maximum of 6 wishes. But in fact, to be able to get 2 or 3 wishes in these 6 years of study was already extremely lucky. Dake was able to get an extra wish in his first year, which was indeed enviable. First website. https://vipkanshu. VIP. But if Principal Aertii was not exaggerating, he indeed had the qualifications to get this opportunity. While most of the students were envious, White, Luo Boat, C. Keat, and Betty were quite depressed, because they were the 4 students that were saved. But fortunately, the school chose to keep it a secret due to the negative impact of the vampire incident, or else they would have lost their faces. Especially in the incident of the Moon Goddess, they were also involved, which was really not an interesting thing. However, what is the Holy Grail? Luo Boat could not help but ask curiously. White suddenly showed a shocked expression. It's the Holy Grail. Luo Boat was a little embarrassed. I know it's the Holy Grail. So what is the Holy Grail? White. I don't know. He had never used it before, so he did not know. White crossed her fingers and rested her chin on her hand, feeling a little envious. I've heard that the Holy Grail is able to grant a person's wish. If the Holy Grail is able to revive a hero, forget it. He knew that it was impossible to succeed. In front of the long table in the aristocratic courtyard, although Dark was surprised, he still accepted this information very well. He also didn't know much about the Holy Grail. He only vaguely remembered that Professor Shi Erfu seemed to have said that there was an inscription engraved on the Holy Grail that seemed to say, "The greedy will have nothing." From the literal meaning, it was obviously a warning. In other words, an overly greedy wish will never come true. But what level of desire would be considered as greed? What was the upper limit of a wish? Only Only by knowing all these could he make the most out of the Holy Grail. Dake thought about it for a while and felt that it was best to ask the professors about it. Perhaps he could ask about it when the principal brought him to use the Holy Grail. Before that, he could list out some of the things he wanted. If it's possible, I really want to make a wish to remove the demonic god's bloodline. Unfortunately, a wish of this level will definitely not come true. Based on this premise, maybe I can make a wish to learn some knowledge and techniques that are difficult to master. For example, the technique of using the demonic brain pipette. Anyway, this is a very good idea. Using this as a reference, I can also make a wish to improve the level of underworld magic, or maybe the ability to control my emotions and so on. Once this idea came to him, it was out of control. Dake was so deep in thought that he didn't respond even when Deanna called him twice. The third time, when Deanna's pink lips were almost on his face, he suddenly came back to his senses. What? Deanna blinked and whispered, "Have you thought about what to wish for?" Dake shook his head. "Not yet. Deanna, how about the candy house?" Dake. After the principal of ARTI announced the reward for Dake, she continued to choose the best second-year students from the previous semester to publicly praise and reward them. Then, it was the third year, the fourth year, the fifth year, and the sixth year. After all 6 grades had gone through their turns, she made a conclusion and proposed some expectations for the future. According to the normal procedure, the principal of ARTI should have ended her speech here, but there was still a necessary part of this year's opening ceremony. The students seemed to have guessed what she was going to say next, so they all quieted down and looked at the stage expectantly. The principal of ARTI smiled and said, "I think everyone has been waiting for this for a long time. Next, let's welcome the new History of Magic professor, the hero of the spear, Mr. Ryan Hux." As soon as she finished speaking, the auditorium was suddenly filled with thunderous applause. A one-legged old man with a prosthetic leg lifted the curtain and slowly walked out from behind the stage. Ryan Hux, a soldier of the spear who was once active on the front lines, a hero who lost a leg, an arm, and an eye in the war. Although people would think of the brave when they mentioned heroes, the brave was only one of many heroes. The reason why humans were able to defeat the demons in the end was not because of one brave, but because of the struggle and sacrifice of thousands of heroes. Ryan Hux was one of those thousands of heroes. Ryan Hux, who walked out from behind the stage, was wearing a suit that was not very suitable for him. He had a thick beard, and his face was full of wrinkles. There was not much hair left on his head. He wore a black eye patch over his right eye, and his left hand and right foot were prosthetic. He held a walking stick in his hand, and he looked like a skinny old man. He did not have the heroic spirit of the hero of the spear at all. Instead, he emitted a strong aura of twilight. The students who applauded when they heard the title of hero could not help but cover their mouths at this moment. Although scars were a warrior's medal, Ryan's injuries were so serious that people even wondered how he survived the war. If one thought about it deeply, they could not help but feel sad. But in times of war, Ryan was only one of the countless gears that formed the basis of victory. After a short silence, even more enthusiastic applause rang out. Clap, 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 clap. Good evening, students. I am honored to be able to work at the Shangmalian Academy as the new professor of the history of magic. Ryan's voice was amplified by the loudspeaker and spread throughout the auditorium. The applause of the students stopped. He looked around and said in a self-consciously humorous tone, "You know, before I got this job, I was in poverty and almost couldn't even open a pot." But the students could not laugh. This old hero of the spear looked very down and out from his appearance. They did not expect it to be true. But was this the end of a hero who paid a huge sacrifice for the victory of the human war? What about the kingdom's pension? What about the post-war subsidies promised by the church? Or was there some other reason that caused this situation? Was the hero of the spear just an exception? All kinds of thoughts appeared in the minds of the students. The cold wind blew away the false enthusiasm and made room for quiet thinking. Ryan was still speaking slowly on the stage. His words were full of gratitude to the headmaster of ARTI. He repeatedly promised that he would prepare for classes seriously to make up for his shortcomings of not being good at teaching and educating people. Fortunately, teaching the history of magic did not require much professional knowledge. It was just that it would be difficult to teach astronomy, which was tied to it. Or maybe the headmaster of ARTI would find a new professor of astronomy. Then, Happy New Year. After Ryan finished speaking, he raised his hand and waved to the students below the stage. He turned around and slowly walked off the stage. The headmaster of ARTI returned to the stage and said, "Mr. Ryan Hicks has rich experience and personal understanding of history. It is because I believe that he can take on the responsibility of teaching the history of magic that I agreed to his application. I hope that in the future of his career, Mr. Hicks can get along well with all of you. Finally, Happy New Year. Happy New Year. Happy New Year." Exquisite food appeared on the table. The opening ceremony had finally advanced to the stage of dinner. The students ate the delicious food and competed to discuss the outstanding students of each grade who had been named, as well as the new professor of the history of magic. Some of the gloomy thoughts gradually disappeared, and were replaced by continuous high excitement. Deanna was still tempting Dake to make a wish to obtain the candy house, and Luosi was thinking about the speech of the hero of the spear. She suddenly asked, "What was Mr. Ryan Hicks's identity during the war?" Dake thought for a moment and replied, "A veteran." Not all heroes were well known. Most people only knew of the existence of a hero like Ryan. But now they had enough time to get to know this old gentleman. Dake was full of respect. To Dake's surprise, before dinner was over, the little elf in the shape of a griffin quietly appeared in front of him. He said goodbye to Deanna and Luosi, and then followed the elf out of the auditorium. The headmaster of ARTI was waiting in the office. Although the headmaster of ARTI on Christmas night was only the manifestation of the elf, it was still her who was talking to him. After that night, Dake's impression of her had changed, and he was more familiar with her. Happy New Year, Dimming. Happy New Year, headmaster. Dake sat down on the sofa at the headmaster's gesture. Two glowing elves were holding the teapot, trying to pour tea. He scratched his ear, took the teapot, and poured himself some black tea. As the aroma of the black tea floated in the air, the atmosphere in the office became more relaxed. The headmaster of ARTI relaxed his shoulders, and his expression softened. "Recently, I really can't relax." Dake took the opportunity to ask, "Headmaster, have you been busy during the holidays?" The headmaster of ARTI nodded helplessly. It's only been a few years since the end of the war, and there are already people who are ready to make trouble. The conflicts between humans and subhumans are becoming more and more frequent. I just wanted to talk to Didi again, but I didn't expect to be delayed. Dake thought for a while. It must have been hard for you to find a suitable professor of the history of magic under such circumstances. The headmaster of ARTI raised his head. "No, it wasn't me who found it. Claire's resignation really bothered me." Dake was a bit surprised. "Did Mr. Hex come to you himself?" The headmaster of ARTI nodded. "That's true. But Mr. Hex is indeed a reliable warrior, and he's very familiar with the history of the war. I hope that the position of professor of the history of magic can help him." Dake. "So Hex wasn't exaggerating, and he's really so poor that he can't even eat?" The headmaster of ARTI sighed. "Dimming. You have to know that this kind of situation is inevitable no matter when and where it is. A hero who lost his limbs because of the war is no longer a hero when the war is over. When the glory of his glory gradually fades, in the eyes of more people, he's just a disabled person who can't help with his work." These words shouldn't have been said to a first-year student, but if it was Dimming, it wouldn't have been a problem. In this era, a 14-year-old could already be in charge of a family. Dimming was more mature. They wouldn't have a bad impression of Dimming because of this. The current kingdom, whether in terms of the legal system or the rule of law, had all kinds of shortcomings. And the church, which was supposed to make up for these shortcomings, was also full of loopholes from top to bottom. When people rejoiced over the victory of the war, all kinds of mistakes that had been covered up by the war were exposed. This was an era that wasn't stable. The peace on the surface might not be able to withstand a gentle push. Who knew when it would suddenly collapse? The headmaster of ARTI didn't dwell on this topic for long. She called Dark over mainly to talk about the matter of the vampires in the secret passage. Dake briefly described the vampire's appearance and said, "I remember that he seemed to call himself Vlad, but Vlad seems to be from a very large vampire family in history. Their members always call themselves Vlad." The headmaster of ARTI said humorously, "That's correct. I've met Vlad I to Vlad XXX. Can you tell me all about your encounters in the secret passage? I'm also very curious about what treasures Yalvet left behind." Dake nodded slightly and told the headmaster of his exploration journey after entering the secret passage. He actually liked the feeling of telling stories, especially when he was the one who experienced it. Felt like he was the main character. But his treasure hunting journey was indeed enough to be written into a book. Perhaps it would sell well. At least the headmaster of ARTI was listening with great interest. So not only did Yalvet set up 2 barriers of strength and wisdom before the secret passage, she also set up a dragon at the end of the passage. When Dake talked about the magic dragon, even the headmaster of ARTI was surprised. In the end, who would put a dragon in front of the treasures they left behind for their students? What was even more surprising was that the student actually passed it. She gently lifted a strand of silver hair and sighed, as expected of Yalvet. "But you don't have to worry too much. The treasure map she left behind is actually a secret passage escape device. 2 in 1. Chapter 223. The Arcanum escape device could be said to be a Shangmalian item. It also had another name, the Dungeon escape device. It was an emergency escape device developed by the Academy for the safety of students exploring the dungeons. However, it could only be used within the Shangmalian Academy. As a first-year student, Dake naturally had never come into contact with the Arcanum escape device. He looked at Headmaster ARTI in surprise. "So, even if we fail to slay the dragon, there won't be any danger?" Headmaster ARTI shook his head. "The Arcanum escape device will only be triggered when the user's life is in danger. Of course, it can also be triggered on its own. In other words, before the user's life was in danger, they would still be injured. However, injuries sustained within the Academy could be healed as long as they were treated in time." Dake understood a little, so he continued to tell the rest of the story. When he reached the mirror chamber in the dragon's nest, Headmaster ARTI couldn't help but laugh. "So, the final test is that?" Dake looked puzzled. He remembered the URL. VIP Kanchu. 6 Headmaster ARTI recalled. That was many years ago. At that time the professor of magic engineering wasn't Kazair. Dake perked up and listened carefully. Professor Kazair and Professor Li were the same. They were both invited to join the Shangmalian Academy after the war. Before them, there was another group of professors in the academy. One of the professors of magic engineering was called Grand Grandel. Just like his name, he was a professor with a lot of personality. Although Professor Grandel was an excellent magus, he was more interested in knowledge other than magic engineering. He called himself the Shangmalian Magus and had developed many little things that could be triggered without the use of magic. He always had many wonderful ideas. Every time he came up with a new invention, he would show it off in front of the students like a child. The mirror chamber left behind by Arvet and Hero Brett was something they had learned from Professor Grandel. Then where is Professor Grandel now? Dake couldn't help but ask. As Principal ARTI spoke, his face fell. Sacrificed. Dake immediately shut his mouth. The headmaster of ARTI regained his composure when he saw him like this. There are always sacrifices in war, and there's nothing we can do about it. During the war, magical engineering technology wasn't as mature as it is now. As the headquarters of magical engineering innovation, Our academy has always been a thorn in the side of the demons. Once, the academy was invaded by the demons. Professor Grandel stepped forward to protect the students and finally died in battle. However, his students didn't let him down. The students that Professor Grandel stood up to protect were the group of people who were later known as the Golden Generation. Hero Valkyrie, Sage of the Beasts, Great Magus, Scarlet Blood Maiden. If it weren't for Professor Grandel's sacrifice, the Golden Generation would have died before they could even grow up. I accidentally ruined the atmosphere. The headmaster of Aertii took a sip of black tea and said, "Let's continue. I can't wait to find out what our vet left behind." Dake said solemnly, "It's 3, a Trinity refining array." A Trinity refining array. The headmaster of Aertii was shocked. Could it be the Triad armament refining array? She actually left it behind in the academy. Dake took the opportunity to ask, "What's the Triad armament refining array?" The headmaster of Aertii said, "It's an armament refining array that our vet created when she was still a student. It's the foundation of the number 99 refining array that was later named the Arvet refining array. At that time, she would always refine the clothes and skirts she made into armament cards." Dake couldn't help but ask, "Can ordinary clothes and skirts be refined into armament cards?" The headmaster of Aertii smiled. "Under normal circumstances it can't be done. However, the Triad armament refining array created by our vet broke this restriction. However, the Triad armament refining array focused on the combination of the mind, magic and armament. It had to be handmade clothes or weapons to be refined into an armament card. From this point of view, it's more difficult to use than other ordinary armament refining arrays." Dake smacked his lips. He suddenly understood that he wouldn't be able to use this armament refining array in the short term. For someone like him who couldn't even make a cosplay prop, it would be hard for him to even make a shell. Goodbye, golden cloth. Goodbye, sinful armament. Goodbye, Iron Man. The headmaster of Aertii shook his head when he saw Dake's undisguised dejection. He said, "The Triad armament refining array doesn't have a high requirement for physical armament. Our vet can replace it with clothes and you can replace it with wood carvings. With your steady fingers, it won't be difficult to learn carving." Dake's heart skipped a beat. That's a good idea. If he could learn carving well, he could even make his own figurines. However, he still had a lot of things to learn and didn't have the time for it. The headmaster of Aertii knew that he already had an idea. He continued, "Since you met White and the others, you should know something. Did you find his treasure?" Dake felt a little helpless when he thought about the hero's treasure. He told the headmaster everything he knew one by one. The headmaster of Aertii was stunned. "The hero's treasure is right next to the dragon's nest mirror room. And it's also a mirror room." Dake nodded. "Yes. That vampire pierced through the wall, so I was able to help them." The headmaster of Aertii said helplessly, "That sounds like something Brett would do. What about the treasure he left behind?" Dake shook his head. "I'm not too sure about that." The headmaster of Aertii said, "Then tell me about the vampire." Dake said, "The vampire Vlad. I've been thinking about it for the past 2 days. He doesn't seem to have any memories." The headmaster of Aertii was surprised. "How can you tell?" Dake said. "He never chanted any spells and his attacks were nothing special. He's completely different from the vampires in the records who are proficient in magic. I was lucky to be able to defeat him." The headmaster of Aertii said, "I see. Then the possibility of an external invasion is much lower. However, that vampire is still very difficult to deal with. The professors still haven't found any traces of him. Unfortunately, there are too many mysteries in the secret passage. Even I can't investigate it thoroughly. The only thing I can do now is to seal the passage temporarily." Dake said, "I hope it works." "Fine." The headmaster of Aertii thought for a moment and suddenly asked, "How much do you know about the Holy Grail?" "It's finally here." Dake perked up and said, Very limited. The headmaster of Aertii clapped his hands, and a fairy flew over with a key in its mouth. She took the key and said, "It's very simple to use the Holy Grail. You just need to close your eyes and make a wish after the Holy Grail is opened. You need to pay attention to the size of the wish. However, this standard varies from person to person. Some people can achieve a breakthrough in their magic power limit by making a wish, but some people can't even achieve a centimeter of growth. The most conservative choice is to make a wish with a material object. Generally speaking, the probability of making a wish with the same object is fixed. I have a list of wishes that I've compiled over the years. You can refer to it." As she spoke, she pulled open the drawer and took out a 4K-sized wish slip. The fairy flew to Dake's side with the list in its mouth. Dake caught it and looked at it carefully. This wish list listed a lot of wishes, and each wish was marked with a rough probability of being fulfilled. Among them, the probability of magic power increase and magic power breakthrough were different. The latter's probability was less than 10%. However, to be able to compile this data, it meant that many students had chosen the magic power breakthrough wish. Magic power was indeed a human's shortcoming. This was a very important wish for both the magicians of the past and the magisters of the present. Once they achieved a breakthrough in magic power with the help of the Holy Grail, their status as a magician or magister would immediately rise by one level. In comparison, the probability of magic power increase was more than 70%. Dake skimmed through it as quickly as possible and got a general idea of the rules of making a wish. The reason why the probability of magic power increase was much higher than magic power breakthrough was because the magic power increase wish didn't have a limit on the amount of magic power increase. It was very easy for the magisters to succeed when their magic power had yet to reach the limit when they were students. Seeing this, Dake more or less understood the range of the Holy Grail wishes. He continued reading. Material wishes were easier to fulfill and had a relatively fixed probability of being fulfilled. The probability of Candy House being fulfilled was more than 80%. Did this mean that there was enough of a base for this to be counted? In short, the easier it was to obtain an item, the easier it was to make a wish. And the rarer the item, the harder it was to make a wish. The probability of obtaining a legendary item through the Holy Grail was almost zero. Wait, it wasn't zero. Dake suddenly looked at the column labeled Legendary Item. The position of the probability of fulfillment was clearly written at 0.1%. The probability was 1 in 10,000. More than 10,000 people had made a wish for a legendary item. Furthermore, one of them had succeeded in fulfilling his wish. Dake couldn't help but look up at Headmaster Aertii. What happened to the greedy ones having nothing? Headmaster Aertii could roughly guess what he wanted to say just by looking at his expression. He couldn't help but smile and say, "You know, only those who have nothing are greedy." How could that be interpreted in reverse? Did you think that the language classes in my 9 years of compulsory education were taught by a physical education teacher? Dake's eyes widened. His various guesses about the Holy Grail were instantly overturned. The only 3 great wishing artifacts in the world might be more terrifying than he imagined. Headmaster Aertii's words were basically telling him that he could be greedy as much as he wanted. Even if he failed because of this, so what? Those wishes that had a high probability of being fulfilled could basically be obtained in reality. But since they could be obtained in reality, what was the point of wishing? This was a rare opportunity to make a wish. Of course, he had to wish for something that was difficult to obtain. No wonder so many people wished for a legendary item. At that moment, Dake couldn't help but want to make a wish directly to remove the demon god's bloodline. He wanted to make a wish that had a probability of less than 1 in 10 million. But he held back in the end. This was a rare opportunity. He wanted to lower his request. And if this wish really came true, he wouldn't have the great sin to draw from. Let's just make a wish that was relatively more reliable. After a cup of tea's time, Dake put down the wish list. He already had an answer in his heart. Headmaster Aertii asked, How about it? Do you want to make a wish tonight, or do you want to wait for a while? Dake directly said, "Let's make it tonight. Strike while the iron is hot." Headmaster Aertii nodded. "Then follow me." Then she got up from her seat and walked to the room behind her. Dake originally thought that it was a secret room, but he didn't expect it to be a lounge with all kinds of equipment. Headmaster Aertii closed the door and walked to the blank wall, waving the golden key in her hand. Then she explained, "This is a door key. As long as you insert the key on a smooth surface, you can open a door that leads to a fixed location." As she spoke, she inserted the key into the wall. The point of contact between the key and the wall immediately rippled like the surface of water. The ripples quickly spread and actually turned into a door. Blick. Headmaster Aertii turned the key, unlocked the door and gently pushed it. An empty secret room with only the Holy Grail came into view. The Shangmalian Holy Grail was made of pure gold. In the eyes of ancient magicians, gold was a metal that contained magic power. It was often used to make precious magic tools. The Shangmalian Holy Grail was also known as the Wishing Cup. It was said that it was made by a god. Headmaster Aertii stepped into the secret room, and Dake followed closely behind. He carefully observed the style of the Holy Grail, and finally found a line of ancient inscriptions on the base. "The greedy have nothing. The unready have nothing." As if it had sensed someone approaching, the Holy Grail released a strange light. Headmaster Aertii raised her hand slightly, and Dake stopped. They were only about 2 meters away, but the aura of the Holy Grail was already clear. The headmaster didn't continue to move forward. Instead, she shook her hand and pulled out a magic wand from her sleeve. The magic wand was only the length of a finger, but with a gentle pull, it was stretched to the length of an arm. She raised the magic wand and gently touched the Holy Grail. Suddenly, spots of light slowly gathered in the Holy Grail. When the power of prayers in the Holy Grail is full, you can make a wish, and the Holy Grail will answer your prayer. The power of prayers in the Holy Grail rippled like wine. The deep color was like the starry sky at night, mottled and sparkling. The wine gradually filled the Holy Grail as if it was inviting someone to drink with it. Dake couldn't help but want to step forward, but with a light touch from Headmaster Aertii, he came to his senses. He couldn't help but feel frightened. The Holy Grail will attract greedy people, but humans are the aggregation of greed. There is no one in this world who isn't greedy. Headmaster Aertii's voice was still in his ears. Under her guidance, Dake closed his eyes and prayed with all his heart. Wishes related to knowledge were more stringent. The probability of obtaining new knowledge that hadn't been recorded was not inferior to the probability of obtaining a legendary item. However, existing knowledge, or even knowledge that was already known, if one only grasped it through making a wish, the probability of it being realized would be much higher. Dake's wish was to improve the technique of using the magic brain dropper. 2-in-14/200. Picture exploded. Chapter 224. Dake's knowledge of the magic brain pipette basically came from the guide to the use of the magic brain pipette. Using the magic brain pipette, not only could it absorb certain emotions, but it could also extract memories from the brain. However, using the magic brain pipette was a very dangerous thing. Even if one had extremely high magic power manipulation skills and the necessary amount of knowledge, there was no guarantee that there would be no problems. It was also because of this that Dake did not dare to go deep into the brain. Instead, he only used the dragonfly skimming the water technique to extract great sins from the outside. After all, inserting a pipette into the brain was really terrifying. It was not acceptable just from a physiological point of view. Moreover, extracting from the brain once a month was already considered a lot. It was not necessarily as convenient as extracting from the outside. Therefore, this time, with the opportunity to make a wish to improve, he was also inclined to start from the outside. It was not the advanced technique of inserting the magic pipette into the brain. Instead, it was a technique that matched the dragonfly skimming the water technique and thinned the brain barrier. Simply put, it was to find a way to reduce the brain's ability to withstand emotional changes in a short period of time to achieve the effect of easier leakage. Remember in 1 second. https://vipcanshu. VIP. But in fact, the advanced level of this technique was not necessarily lower than the technique of extracting emotions deep into the brain. He thought so in his heart. When he made a wish, he could not help but think in this direction. The power of the wish born from this was absorbed by the Holy Grail and would give a corresponding response. And after carefully studying the wish list, Dake had actually mastered some techniques. The best way to increase the success rate of the wish was to not bite the wish to death. Not increase the success rate by 10 times, but increase the success rate by a little. In this way, the chances of the wish coming true would be much higher. This time, he did the same. About 2 or 3 minutes later, the Holy Grail finally reacted. As if stars had dripped into it, the wine in the cup suddenly rippled like a starry night spreading out, emitting dark ripples one after another. Dake, who had his eyes tightly closed, suddenly saw that scene. The stars that fell into his mind turned into flowing memories as if he had been born with it. Now it was just a memory. He had indeed received a response. "How is it?" Headmaster Aertii asked softly. Dake opened his eyes with excitement. "Feels great." Principal Aertii smiled and said, "It seems like you've succeeded." Dake nodded slightly. "To some extent." Headmaster Aertii raised his wand again. "Then let's leave this place first." She pointed her wand at the Holy Grail, and the ripples that resembled the starry night quickly shrank. Then the wine in the Holy Grail also gradually receded, leaving only a thin layer behind. The Holy Grail was still exuding its unique aura, but it was no longer as enticing as before. The two of them left the secret chamber. Principal Aertii locked the door and pulled out the key. The door leading to the secret room immediately disappeared, and the wall returned to normal. It was only then that the principal spoke again. "You succeeded on your first try. You're pretty lucky," Dake said. "My luck is always good at critical moments." Principal Aertii: "Do you mind telling me your wish?" Dake: "Of course not." This was actually a necessary procedure after making a wish. Dake already knew this when Principal Aertii took out the wish list. Every year, after the Holy Grail wishing session, the students would report their wishes to the school so that the school could compile the data. Therefore, on the surface, his wish had nothing to do with the demon god's bloodline. Emotions and memories had always been the subject of his research. "You're actually using the demon brain pipette." Principal Aertii was still surprised, and showed an obvious intention to dissuade him. Dake explained that he was only using the dragonfly skimming the surface of the water method. Principal Aertii was slightly relieved, but still said, "Even if you're only extracting it from the outside, it can't completely eliminate the danger. I personally suggest that you wait until you're in your 3rd year, no 4th year before trying this topic again." However, she immediately praised. "But your wish is very clever. You didn't choose to go deep into the brain directly, but from the side. It's a safer choice. If my guess is correct, you should have learned a subtractive type of mental magic from the Holy Grail." Dake said in admiration. "Yes, I only wanted to learn some related techniques to the demon brain pipette." Principal Arte said, "Mind magic is one of the most difficult spells to learn, even among the many types of magic. Without a huge knowledge system as a framework, it's very difficult to achieve anything in this field. You should already have the foundation of mental magic, right?" Dake: "Professor Kazair taught me the nether spirit technique." Principal Aertii: "No wonder. That's the prerequisite for your wish to be fulfilled. Mental magic, soulless curse." It was a mental magic that had almost the same effect as the soulless water. Using the soulless curse on a person would cause them to lose consciousness for a short period of time. At the same time, the bond between the soul and the body would become loose, and the matter of the mind would become unstable, making it easier for it to be separated from the brain. Because the soulless curse was too difficult to learn, the soulless water was created later on. Humans who were injected with the soulless water were the perfect seedbed for the demon parasites. In the era when the demon race still existed, the soulless water was the most commonly used medicine when the demon parasites were experimenting. Although many people thought this was a very evil magic, magic itself was not divided into good and evil. The professors of Shangmalian Academy were especially clear about this aspect. The soulless curse that Dake learned with the Holy Grail was only at the beginner level. However, if he could find a way to learn it later on, he would have a chance to master it further. Unknowingly, it was almost time for curfew. Dake and Principal Aertii talked for a while about emotional research and benefited a lot. Then, he took the initiative to leave and left the principal's office with a reward of 10,000 credits. To a first-year student, a reward of 10,000 credits was a huge sum of money. If converted into holy coins, it would be a total of 160,000 holy coins. However, if he really wanted to use it, it was just as though. Dake did not dare to think too much. He only hoped that he could use the 10,000 credits to successfully refine the fusion card. After jumping to January, the temperature in Shangmalian dropped another level. Walking alone in the cold castle, it felt like it would freeze at any time. Dake hugged his hands and blew on the hot air, thinking that maybe he should install a heater in the dormitory. He wondered if the magic elves were doing their homework seriously. Basic education was not something that could be achieved overnight. Dake did not have much hope for the magic elves, so any results were a pleasant surprise. With the start of the new semester, the recruitment window for the duel club reopened. With his current strength, it was easy to pass the review, but to participate in the formal duel competition, he needed to have at least 40 magic elves cards. If the number of cards in a group was less than 40, he could only participate in the newcomer competition. Normally, the first and second year students would be assigned to this group. Just thinking about it made him excited. After taking a picture with the feathered serpent statue guarding the tower door, Dake entered the common room in the tower of the aristocrat house. The aftertaste of the opening ceremony was still there, and there were still about a dozen people in the common room. However, most of them were either reading or playing chess. It was very quiet. The aristocrat house was far less noisy than the night house, and it was also not as quiet as the magic academy. Such an atmosphere was very rare. If it was a normal day, Dake would most likely sit in such a common room for a while. However, not tonight. He still had many things to do. Click. The moment he unlocked the door, Dake clearly felt a large movement in the dormitory. When he pushed the door open and entered, he saw the magic elves sitting in a row obediently. Except for the trash slime, they were all doing their homework seriously. However, he only took a glance and knew that they were just putting on an act. They even learned to put on an act? Dake almost laughed out of anger. What followed was a thunderstorm. The two magic elves who did the least homework were taken out to reflect on their mistakes. Dake scolded them again for a while before taking out the experimental equipment and starting the Great Sin extraction experiment. There was not much time left tonight, so he could only do this experiment. Pride 105, Wrath 89, Greed 103, Bliss 106. Let's start with greed. No, let's start with the soulless curse experiment. Little evil magical beast. Here. The complete incantation of the soulless curse was very long. It would take at least 5 minutes to read it from beginning to end at a normal speed. However, using a simple incantation, this time could be shortened to a little more than a minute. The entry-level soulless curse used a simple incantation, and its effect was not as good as the soulless water. However, if the effect was too good, it would make Dake feel troubled. When a mage cast a spell, they could adjust the magic within a certain range. For example, they could remove some effects and increase the proportion of some effects. The soulless curse could cause people to faint. Dake relied on the soulless curse, mastered by the Holy Grail to control the effects of fainting, and it would not cause the caster to become absent-minded. Moreover, the overall effect lasted for a very short time, only 3 minutes. In other words, there was no need for the entushing potion to return to normal after 3 minutes. If this level of soulless curse was placed in the normal magic evaluation system, it would definitely fail. However, what he needed was this kind of soulless curse that failed. The little evil magical beast was summoned with a sad face. It would rather reflect on its mistakes. It only had wings and no hands, so it could only stand on one leg when doing homework and use the other hand to hold a pen and write. That was quite tiring. Every time it saw the hawkmen who also had wings but claws, the little evil magical beast would be envious and jealous. Therefore, there was a reason for it to be lazy and not do homework. However, this reason would not work in front of Dake. Is there a small red flower reward for helping with the experiment? The little evil magical beast reluctantly came to its master and asked softly. Dake revealed a big smile. Course there is. Soulless curse. Ah! The little evil magical beast screamed, but nothing happened. All the magic elves looked over curiously, allowing it to enjoy the experience of being an actor in the limelight. Dake then took out the happy card that he had not used for a long time. As the little evil magical beast was enveloped by the light of the happy card, the painful expression on its face disappeared in an instant, and a smile bloomed, looking satisfied. The effect is indeed more obvious than using the happy card alone. Dake tried to talk to the little evil magical beast in this state. He found that its thoughts were still clear. It was neither unconscious nor absent-minded. As long as it was controlled properly, it would not affect the progress of the experiment. It seems feasible. Originally, this was just a safety experiment. The soulless curse given by the Holy Grail met his needs in all aspects. Dake put away the happy card and waited quietly for 3 minutes. 3 minutes later, the little evil magical beast, who had made a fool of itself, cried and ran to the small bed. It crawled under the cute little blanket, only revealing half of its feet. When Dake was about to start the experiment of extracting the great sin, it ran back and desperately hinted at the little red flower. Dake gave it a little red flower and then confiscated it. The reward for helping with the experiment and the punishment for slacking off. Maybe this is a carrot and a stick, a combination of kindness and punishment. Dake couldn't help but laugh out loud. The little evil magical beast. After the soulless curse safety was verified, Dake began the official experiment. The subject of the experiment was not greed, but fury. His main goal was to see if the great sin that was less than 100 points could escape from the skull, and then use the dragonfly skimming the water method to extract it. Before that, he had to use the underworld spirit spell to make his mind highly concentrated. The underworld spirit spell and the soulless curse seemed to conflict, but in fact they weren't. The underworld spirit spell made one's mind highly concentrated, while the soulless curse made the outer barrier of the mind loosen. By guiding it with one's mind, the mind could be drawn out of the brain. Dake picked up the magic brain dropper, killed it, and then blew it dry. After a while, he suddenly narrowed his eyes and condensed his mind power. He had entered the underworld spirit state. Soulless curse. It was the first time he had cast a curse on himself, so Dake was inevitably a little nervous. But the effect was as expected. He could feel some of his thoughts drifting outwards. This was actually extremely dangerous. If he wasn't careful, it wouldn't be his emotions that drifted out, but his memories. But fortunately, his soulless curse was an inferior version, so it was still within his control. After that, Dake immediately followed the method of invoking emotions in the guide to using the magic brain dropper, and only used fury. But after a while, he gradually opened his eyes. Failed. Fury stopped when it was still some distance away from the barrier, and it couldn't be lured out. Dake didn't feel discouraged because of this. He carefully recalled what he had felt just now, and then carefully thought about it. More than 10 minutes later, the second experiment began. This time he gave up on fury, and used the most familiar pride as the experiment target. Release, release, release again. With his increasingly clear perception of pride, he could clearly sense that the part of pride that had spilled out of his brain had exceeded 5 points. 2 in 1 4150 words. You're tuning in to the Whispers of Romance YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.